government, which is now under his control, should be purging people from the rolls. And that is something that the radical right has been trying to do now for literally years. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And well, I can tell it to you now. The reason that that state secretaries of state are like, we're not handing that stuff over, is because the federal government has no jurisdiction over our elections. Those are state run. And there are times at which the federal government can get involved, generally when it appears that there is some kind of deliberate suppression of a class of voters. But this is not, our elections are not federally run, they are state run. So they're trying to say, well, for a long time, they were trying to say, the Republicans in the Trump administration were trying to say, well, we need that access so we can make sure the voter rolls are okay. But that just changed really abruptly on last Saturday. So let me walk you through the rest of why he would want to do this. One is that if he can actually get his hands on voter rolls, they can do a number of things. They can throw out people's names on the grounds that they think the people trying to suppress votes, they say the voters have moved. Now, there are a number of ways that you can do that. You can write to an address that somebody has, and you can say you have to return this envelope, or we will throw your name off the rolls because you obviously don't live there any longer. But that's not as clear cut as it sounds, because you can do things like you can send out a letter so that it looks like junk mail and people don't know it's real. There are all kinds of ways to purge the voter rolls of legitimate voters, because the truth is that there's actually remarkably little double voting. And funnily enough, a lot of it lately has been Republicans trying to believe that it does happen. And they're the ones who are getting caught, proving the system actually works. What happens is that many people, when they move, don't bother to call the former place where they lived, and tell them to take them off the rolls. So those just kind of become, dummies. The name is on the roll, but nobody votes there any longer. And there used to be, in our system, something called ERIC, by which a number of the states could compare lists and could say, oh, we've got Heather Richardson now, so she's still over there, you need to cut off the rolls, just to keep them cleaned up. It's just easier for people not to have all the, the sort of old, useless addresses any longer. But many of the Republican states under Trump pulled out of ERIC with the idea that they would be able to purge their lists more effectively if there wasn't some kind of national oversight of what they were doing. So part of it is this attempt to get your hands on the rolls and start to throw people off them. But then there's another piece of that that's really important, and that is sowing the idea that our elections don't work. And this Trump has been trying to do forever, right? Even before 2020, he Roger Stone had bought the website that was called Stop the Steal. I mean, this was what they were going to do. They never thought they would get the kinds of numbers that they got to actually elect Trump. So they were going to argue that the election was stolen from them. And that's been his MO all along. So he's really hammered
freaking web browser one was so much easier than what I don't understand.
Okay, and that anytime he loses an election,
the OBS server.
from him.
I just said, hey, do YouTube, do Twitch, and just did it. Now I don't even know if I'm live on Twitch.
That's the backstory there. Now at Davos, he said we're going to see prosecution.
I'm live on YouTube.
Yesterday, we
got YouTube.
FBI raid.
This is Timberborn. It seems very basic.
Where those ballots were.
Cute little graphics.
Under seal by a court.
Lots of little details.
And now that chain of custody has been broken. That is.
It's kind of fun to play around and see what you can do.
The evidence is contaminated now. For all we know, some FBI agent put and I'm not saying they did, but this is why you want a chain of command. Put a box of ballots in the back of their Subaru. I mean, we don't know. That's why you have these very specific,
I'm trying to run out of metal.
Chains of custody.
We're kind of heading this way. I don't know what's
that
way
ever
to
done by
go
one
about
person. Everybody's trained and all that to protect that idea of the voting. So the other thing that's interesting about what happened at Fulton County was that one of the people who was photographed there inside the truck was the director of national intelligence. The Director of National Intelligence has nothing to do with voting. The Director of National Intelligence under Trump is Tulsi Gabbard. She's been very much sidelined from the Trump administration. They are joking internally that DNI stands for Do Not Inform, and you will know you haven't seen her around in a while. But the Director of National Intelligence is supposed to be focusing on the intelligence communities and coordinating among them so that we know what kind of threats are out there against the United States. And the fact that she was in on this, many people
I'm working on trying to get the tube system. The tube system is brand new for the INT. It's a lot harder than the regular beavers, where you just attach a little line.
So that is also out there. And all that points to something else. And I will come back to that in a minute. But
I guess it's twice as fast as a zip line.
I'm gonna do what seems like a weird segue from that into what's happening in Minneapolis and to some degree in Maine. And I will try and talk more about Maine now because that's important too. But what you've seen in Minneapolis is not about undocumented immigrants. It just isn't. And what you've seen across this country is not about undocumented immigrants. And why do I know that? Because first of all, so many of the people that they are calling undocumented are undocumented only because the Trump administration changed the rules while they were already here legally. And now they're saying you're here illegally, and they're picking them up at their appointed scheduled interviews because of the systems under which they had come in. So that's one of the reasons you know that's not the case. But then you also that this is about undocumented immigrants. But you also know it's not about undocumented immigrants because they're only going after undocumented immigrants of color. There's significant numbers of undocumented immigrants in this country from Russia. There are significant numbers of them from Ireland. Now, some of those people are getting picked up, but mostly they are going after undocumented people of color. So there is that, but then there's also this. There has always been, not always, I'm sorry, there has recently been immigration and customs enforcement that does, in fact, find, arrest, and deport undocumented immigrants, focusing primarily on those undocumented immigrants who have committed crimes or criminal histories, or somehow are sort of the people that they
I
really
automate
want
with my
to
population counter
from this country.
That's kind of our deep.
That's always been the case.
They kind of have
So
a
what
hard
you're
time
looking at in Minnesota and in
keep your
Maine,
population
for example,
steady.
are surges. These are extra people coming in to make a statement to those communities. And the argument that Trump is trying to make,
we're a little bit too heavy right now.
The worst of the worst, but you know as well as I do that what they're doing is they're taking people from their jobs, they're taking people from schools, they're separating parents and children.
I'm hoping people on YouTube, but no one's on yet.
Message, first of all, to immigrants, don't come to this.
I don't know.
But think about what that does.
I'm recording, I guess. I guess I can always restream.
In the affluent suburbs of Chicago, for example, or in Minnesota, or in Maine, is they are trying to tell Americans, in general, that they're in charge. This is a dominance play. This is, we're going to hurt these people,
on YouTube? This
so you don't dare to go up against us. This is
so today we showed the Pipla
American society.
42 promo.
And that's a really important concept to get, because even though they're hurting one
Those
population,
the
they're
church
hurting the population in part because they want
40
to hurt the
promo.
population.
See,
But part of the
get
message,
rid of that today, and then we're getting rid of this chimchar.
Americans are supposed to be
We gotta
taking
put this.
away
How
from
did you
the
sell it so
tax
fast?
on individuals in Minnesota, for example,
You listened it too low?
is that you must not stand against the Trump administration.
I was right about everything.
Now, why would you be doing that? You'd be
Yesterday
doing
at
that
30, and
for
I
a number of reasons.
Sunday, and guess what?
First
Everybody
of
turned
all,
on
because
30
what
now.
you are trying to establish, and I think what the administration is trying to establish, is that Trump, and
Yesterday.
perhaps people like him, but mostly Trump,
When do we open
is
these?
the only legitimate
Yesterday, yeah.
ruler of this country.
Right after we open them.
If you get rid of the idea that everybody should have a say in their society, if you say, well, it's not okay for Fulton County to have voted for Joe Biden. I don't care that they did by almost 12,000 or more votes than they voted for Trump. They voted for Trump. But we should get rid of those because Trump really should be the person in charge. And similarly, if you take those ballots and those lists and say, I think we should just get rid of all the people in Fulton County because they tend to vote Democratic. Or I think we should just get rid of all the women, which is not necessarily happening there, but it's happened in other states because they tend to vote Democratic, which they do, by the way. Women began to break away from the Republican Party and switch to the Democratic Party in 1980, and that gap is actually quite large now. What you're saying is that we don't really believe in democracy. We want to make sure we only have our voters show up. And if we don't win nonetheless, that means that the votes are illegitimate. Even if the person legally voted and all that, by definition, those are illegitimate. And that's a really important concept right now because Donald Trump his popularity has dropped to an average of, I think it's 39.2%. He's underwater on every single issue. They are in real trouble. His mind is deteriorating by the minute. As his policies are coming into play, you're seeing things that, of course, are breaking my heart, but it is what it is. This is what he has said he would do, and he did it. The trade agreements that have made America so incredibly prosperous, he just tore up.
Yeah, this one these are going to be a little hard.
What you're seeing is other countries simply making their own trade agreements without the U.S. So Canada, for example, last week, or maybe it's earlier this week, I've actually lost track of what day it is, made a really big trade agreement with India. And the U.S., really, I think that Trump thought that he would have enough power with the U.S. economic system to basically make demands against anybody. And that probably would have worked in 1960, but maybe even 1970. But by now, countries are strong enough to work without us. They don't want to. They, of course, would rather work with the U.S., but they're not going to do it on his terms. As that happens, you're seeing really hard hits against American farmers, for example. Our economic growth has slowed dramatically. There's all this stuff going on. And as that happens, his popularity is only going to decline. So they're looking at that, and they're looking at this incredible outpouring over Minneapolis. And I think they are moving toward the idea of simply declaring that any kind of vote that is not for Donald Trump or the MAGA Republicans is illegitimate. And somebody wrote today and said that they were really shocked that I, of all people who is, tend to be pretty measured and let's not freak out and all that kind of stuff, said that. And because, that's such an extreme thing to say. And I had to laugh a little bit because, of course, not laugh, but of course.
Oh, wow, they're using the tube to build, so I don't need to build this. Okay.
Because this is Reconstruction. Really cool. This is exactly what happened during Reconstruction, where increasingly the Southern Democrats defined legitimate voting as people who would back the Democrats and insisted that anybody, black or white, people forget there were white Republicans in the American South after the Civil War, black or white who voted for that party was by definition illegitimate. And this comes to a head, of course, in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, when a group of black Republicans and white populists elected fairly take over the city government. They are elected to take over the city government, and the Southern Democrats come in and they say, we don't care that you had the right to vote. You are illegitimate. You are illegitimate governors of this state, of this city. And they get rid of them all at gunpoint. They later said, that they were the best people of the city who were reclaiming the government for the good guys. And they understood they really weren't qualified to govern, so they simply walked away. Well, they walked away after, I think it was about 60 people were killed. And then from that, we got, among other things, it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but among other things, they made a declaration of principles. The people who had essentially committed a coup created a declaration of principles. And if you know the work of the guy who wrote Birth of a Nation, that film Birth of a Nation, you know that he picked up that declaration almost word for word and put it in, I think it was his first book. I think it was Leopard Spots. I'm sorry, his first famous book, which was Leopard Spots. So what he was arguing at that point was the only legitimate voters were white Democrats. And that was partly the emphasis on white, but partly the emphasis was on Democrats. And so the reason that I'm watching this now and saying, boy, does this look like what's happening, is not me being an alarmist. It's me saying, we did this before. I mean, this is like, I could write this script. In fact, I have written this script in about 4 books because this is one of my primary field of study, my academic primary field of study. So I think that's what we're seeing there. Now, here's the big but. But the real thing that is happening now, and why so many people have identified what happened with the killing of Alex Preddy and before him, Renee Good in Minneapolis, is a couple of things. One is that it appears to be a turning point. And it appears to be a turning point for one important reason and one really quirky reason. One important reason is that, let me give you 3 reasons, is that it is a new moment when the power of the state is used to kill a white man and a white woman. It should not make a difference, but it does. When the majority of American voters, are still white, look at somebody like Renee Good or Alex Preddy and they say, that could be me, that matters. It would be nice if they said it about everybody, but it certainly matters in that case. It also matters, and this in a funny way was perhaps even more significant than that, and that's that the administration came right up and lied. Immediately came out and said he was an assassin, he was going to massacre people, and so on. That, you could not look at those videos and say that that narrative was correct. Now, some people still are saying it for sure, and I'm not going to talk about them right now, but there are a lot of people who said they're lying to me. And that visceral sense that your government thinks you're so stupid that they are lying to you, that pissed a lot of people off who otherwise were maybe not paying that close attention. And there's the other really weird, quirky thing. My friend Joanne always talks about the contingency of history. More than 80% of Americans have seen that video of Alex Preddy getting shot. Why have that many people seen that video? Well, it's horrifying, of course, and all that. It happened on a weekend when everybody was stuck inside because of a snowstorm. One of those weird things where, it's not like New Year's Eve where people wouldn't have been out or whatever. It hit right at a moment when 80% of Americans have seen that video, which is, by the way, is huge coverage. That's almost nobody ever sees 100% of something. That is huge coverage. So one of the things that has done is it has really heightened something important in Minneapolis, which, by the way, I would argue has been happening all across the country now for a long time. And that's that ordinary American people have been out in front, standing up to ICE. So one of the things that the administration has been trying to do is to demonstrate that it was dominant. This is why Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has been having all these stupid videos and all these pictures, and you've got Greg Bovino walking around in his coat that's supposed to look like a Nazi coat and all that. They're really trying to project this incredible sense of power. They don't have the numbers. And focusing on what is happening in Minnesota, you are watching those people who are trying to project this idea of strength get overwhelmed by ordinary people, by people who are just showing up with whistles and hot chocolate and standing up for their neighbors. And that has been a major puncture of that dominance narrative. So what's happened from that? A couple of things. First of all, the administration came out and so many media channels fell for this, which I have to say, if you are still falling for anything that the administration says, you're in the wrong business, right? Like, look at what people do, not what they say. The administration came out and said, we're going to back off, we're going to pivot, we're going to whatever. And that's just crap. I mean, so what they did is they moved Greg Bovino, who was the leader of Border Patrol, back to his home sector where they said he's probably going to resign. He's a real, violent, let's make this as dangerous as we can. We want to hurt people. He's that guy, And then they moved in Tom Homan, and Tom Homan is the border czar, but that doesn't actually mean anything. That's not like a real title. It means he's just an advisor to the president. He doesn't really have a portfolio except that he's an advisor. He's no prize, let me tell you. He's the guy that the FBI has him, I believe, on tape accepting a bag of $50,000 in cash in a kava bag, which is why you're seeing all the jokes about kava bags. But he basically sort of said, well, we're going to pull people out of Minnesota as soon as they do what we tell them to. And the bottom line is they're going to do a lot of window dressing, but they are not going to back down. They're absolutely not going to back down because Trump can't back down. And I don't mean that just in terms of politics, which it is also part of the story here. He does not have a personality that can back down. Those people do not back down. They might go sideways to try it in a different way, but he will not stop until he is stopped. End of discussion.
The part that I wanted that he had listed, and then he found one that he wanted that I had listed, and they're the same price, right? He wanted the shipping labels.
But that's really not going to happen until a few other pieces move. So
for $1 each,
one of the things
to each other, so he
about
bought it and I bought it.
Indicates just how bad things are is that today they made a big deal of the fact that Susan Collins, who is running for
the thing about it is the cards are worth more than their dollar, so
for the Senate
from
Maine, said she's got trouble with the surge out of Maine. Well, that just says to you just how bad this
getting
is
it over here
for
and seeing it, make
Republicans,
sure,
that this
and then
is
I'll just get mine
pretty
off
clearly
plate.
going to kill her Senate chances, her chances of re-election to the
You know?
Senate, unless he pulls out.
And
So
I'll just
keep
mess
that in
it up.
mind.
Like, hey, bro, I'm gonna give
Because
you like
the
an
other thing you're
extra like
seeing on the heels of all
$5
of this
card,
is
no
don't
badass
believe for a
or
second
whatever.
anybody's pulling stuff
You know?
back. They are not.
Yes.
They're just not.
Because
But
that's one
what
of
you
the
are
things.
So
starting
one
to
couldn't you
see
give him a bad review
is
because it's in the right card?
splintering
Yeah,
within
well,
the
what is
White
that
House.
gonna do? How is that gonna put
And
more?
Has he sold a
that's
bunch of stuff for it
really
already or
important.
no?
It's important
Yeah,
not to
well,
decide
remember
on
you
what's
sent
there,
me
but it's
3
important
I don't
to
think
decide
you'd
what's to
be
come.
screw you over then. So I wouldn't do it. I'd just
Immediately,
Send it.
well,
there were a couple of factions in the White House over immigration. One of
Oh,
them
that's kind of why
was
they
the
want to take
one
the
that
packages
is
with it.
Stephen Miller, the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, Kristi Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem's advisor, Corey Lewandowski on the one side, and then there was Tom Homan on the other. Now, Tom Homan, as I say, is no prize, but he cares about the survival of ICE and Border Patrol as institutions. So they were at each other's throats because Homan thought that the sort of made-for-TV stuff that Kristi Noem was doing, egged on by Stephen Miller, was going to destroy ICE and Border Patrol. So they've been at each other's throats. What happens is that after they all screw up Minnesota so badly,
Trying to get this card off of me.
saying that this was all the fault of the victim, the
It's so
White
good.
House
It's such a
moved
good card.
Bovino, who was part of the Noem,
Not like people
Miller
slept on it, so whenever I
Lewandowski
saw it, I was like, damn,
off
that's
signs,
pretty
right? They
nice.
moved him back to wherever he came from and put
I was
sort of said, we're gonna
right.
put Homan here. Well, remember that one of the things that Trump always likes to do, and this we actually know from Epstein, who did Jeffrey Epstein, who did an interview about it, is he likes to keep people fighting for his approval. He likes there to be fighting, infighting.
Sure.
Because that means that nobody will gang
Yep.
up against him, and it always lets him sort of be the decision maker and the peacemaker. It's a really common thing for narcissists to do, by the way, is to stir up trouble so that then they get to be the ones to solve it. So on the heels of this, almost immediately, it looks like Kristi Noem's going to be under the bus. And Kristi Noem comes out and she says, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but everything I have done, I have done at the
Want to do it
orders
now?
of the president and
Yeah, but what's that
Stephen
preview?
Miller. She leaked that.
No,
to-
I don't think you should.
know that
Not in our
stuff.
urban.
She leaked it to somebody who leaked it to him.
The microwave?
Well, what's going on with that? First of all, a lot of people have picked up
I'd
the
wait a
fact
couple
that she's
days.
using the same excuse that didn't work at Nuremberg, but inherent in that is
got
the
something?
bigotry stuff that's illegal. You know, why else would you need to hide
You
behind
got
someone
something or
else?
what?
If
What
you've
do you
done
got
stuff you were
something?
proud
You
of,
know it?
you'd want to be
I
out
got a
there
little heating
and
pad
saying,
coming.
hey, that was my idea, right? Have you ever seen a politician who was reticent about taking credit for stuff, except maybe Joe Biden, right? Which was a mistake. Like, they're out there all the time going, look what I did, look what I did, look what I did. And she's like, I had nothing to do with it. Well, of course, Miller promptly came out and tried to blame the Bavino and the Border Patrol agents, saying, well, they said he had a gun. The point here is that you're starting to see infighting among the people there, and that infighting is going to get worse and worse as Trump's numbers get worse and as he continues to deteriorate. And as they fight, they're going to leak more and more to the press. And this is actually interesting, but it's also going to be an important thing going into 2026, is watching this begin to crumble. So that's sort of the background there. But I also want to give you one more piece before I sign off, and that is, somebody has asked, because I keep saying how very concerned I am about what you can only describe as concentration camps. And I have to be very clear about the difference between a concentration camp and a death camp. A concentration camp is a camp where you push a whole bunch of people together because you're trying to limit their movement or gather them together for one reason or another, usually in some kind of a military context. Obviously, I'm kind of giving you the
I don't think it's no room that.
Theoretical definition of it. And they are often characterized by death, by disease, and by maltreatment. Because you're crowding so many people together there, and there's rarely enough medical care and all that. That's what a concentration camp is. So people do die in them. But that's different than a death camp, which is where you bring people together with the explicit intention of killing them. And so when you hear concentration camp and someone goes, oh, it's not that bad. No, these are concentration camps. They just are. And I have said that I am very concerned about them. And I'm very concerned about them for overall, well, I guess more than one reason. One reason is because concentration camps never go well. Like if you're putting people in concentration camps, it's not because you're about to throw everybody a big party, right? There's always something bad about them inherently, right? And the history of concentration camps is actually quite interesting, which I won't. That's a rabbit hole I won't go into now. But beyond that, in this particular moment, the United States has a history of incarcerating more people per capita than any other country. So we have a history of prisons, many of which are for-profit prisons, which I cannot tell you what a big problem I have with, because it pays you to keep people incarcerated, pays corporations to keep people incarcerated. But more specifically in this moment, once again, the fact that we don't know what's happening in these camps has my hair on fire as somebody who studies history. And the fact that the Department of Homeland Security is refusing the ability of Congress critters to do oversight of those camps, which by law they are supposed to be able to do, again says to me, if you were happy and proud of what you were doing, you'd say, come on in. We'd love to have you take a look at, for example, something I will be talking about. The state of Maine has the lowest rate of people going back to jail after they leave, back to prison after they leave, because they've got this incredible program of going back to school and everything behind bars. And it's such a big deal that people brag about it. They talk it up. There's a new book coming out about it. That's a really big thing. Are you seeing any books or people bragging about what they're doing in those concentration camps? You're not. And we also, so I'm worried about it because of that, but I'm also worried about it for something somebody asked about. You asked about the missing people from the facility in Florida. I won't use those cutesy names. That to me is trying to whitewash what's going on in these things. So that that really bothers me. They've done it for each state, but there are rumors, of course, that those people have been disappeared in some fashion nefariously. That means the end of their lives. And what I would say to that is that we have no evidence of that. But what we do have from this administration and from Trump beforehand is the tendency to lose people officially. That is to have them fall off the list, so you don't know where they are.
What?
Same with those ballots. The chain of custody.
You want my help? I can do it later.
You incarcerate
streaming
someone
right now.
in.
I'll do it.
I'm going to make this up. Massachusetts. But then you move them down to New Orleans, and then you turn around and you move them to Texas. And oh, oopsie poopsie, maybe we move them over here. So their lawyers lose track of them, the system loses track of them, their family loses track of them, and then they become officially erased. They're still people, they're still not erased, but they fall off the justice system. They fall out of the rule of law, not by you actually saying, I'm going to push you out of it, at which point your lawyer would say, hey, no, you're not, but simply by erasing you.
I don't even know how he got stuck out there.
Almost like a shell game. You know, we'll just move the shells around until nobody can remember where that P is, and then the P doesn't exist anymore. And that, I think, is what we're seeing. And when you ask about the missing people in Florida, my guess is that's what's happened. They've been moved around. You know, these flights are going out of the U.S. all the time, but where are they going? You know, we know where some of them are going, but, you know, some countries are taking detainees from other countries, and we don't know where the records go there. That is, I can't even think of the right word. That is a tragedy for sure, but it is also an extraordinary stain on the United States of America.
$32, you said?
That is something that,
It was $25
is really important for us to always keep in mind and to keep front and center. And I will be writing on that
35. You should make at least 10.
Because the history of, you know, when the New York Times first wrote about Hitler's concentration camps, they said they were work camps, and if you know, they were clean and nobody complained, and if you worked hard for a year, you got to go home. And of course, you know, you look back at that and you think, how could they be so foolish? That's one of the reasons that I am so frantic about these camps now. And I would love to be proven wrong. I cannot tell you how much it would be great if someone played this tape someday and said, what a weenie she was. She was all worried, and really, you know, the kids were all in school and everybody had medical care. Oh, by the way, we know that there has been no medical care there because of the change in paperwork. Judd Layton covered that in the last couple of weeks. But like I said, I'd love to be proven wrong, but boy, all the neon signs are flashing. All right, so if that's the case, where am I going to leave you with this? There are a couple things I want you to
are the oats.
First of all, the Epstein files, they're working real hard to keep those under wraps. And that
far
says
away
to
in
me
my
that there's something, a lot of
beavers will
things
get
that
hungry
are
and thirsty on the way over there.
by the way,
They will survive.
everyone's
or die.
talking about
Not most of them
the interpersonal stuff in those files, and as far as I'm concerned, that's already horrific. So whatever else is in there, I'm sure is going to be just awful. I'm watching Senator Wyden, really closely on this, because he traces the money. He's always looking at the money, and again, maybe I'm wrong about this. I can tell you why I tend to think this way. It was from an old lady, an old advisor of mine, mentor of mine, who always used to say, "Follow the money, Heather." I think that when they start pulling apart the money of what happened with Epstein, I think there's going to be a lot of people involved. And I also think we're going to see some surprises about where Trump's role was in that. And it was not just, I think, as a customer. So that's interesting that they're still out there and not being touched. But here's the other thing I would say, is that what Minnesota has demonstrated is that strongman vision of Trump's that they have been trying to sell to people with these videos and with these over-the-top speeches, Hegseth there pretending he was the scene from Patton and all that, have proven that they're not nearly as strong as the American people when they come together for each other. And, you know, I don't know, I mean, I actually do know people in Minnesota, but I don't know what initially inspired them to get out on the streets. I sincerely doubt that people turned up on the streets because they said, we want to protect our Fourth Amendment rights. I think they showed up because they wanted to protect their neighbors and they wanted to take care of each other. And that has proven itself to be the strongest force in the world. And we need to hold on to that, because I think the tendency might be to say, oh, they've learned their lesson now. I promise you, they need to hold on to power. The Republicans need to hold on to power, or what's happening in those camps is going to come out, or what they're doing with the ballots is going to come out, or what they're doing with the financing is going to come out, or the fact that Trump is pocketing gazillions of dollars is going to come out. And so they are determined to hang on to power at all costs, because if they don't, it's all going to come out. And so this idea that they're pivoting and they're going to pull back, now is the time to push harder, not less. And I'm sure you've heard about the fact that tomorrow, January 30th, there is a general strike across the country. It's been pretty hastily put together, so I don't know how much it will affect the entire economic system, but please be aware of that as well. So there is that, this idea that we must continue to keep the pressure on. But I'm going to add to that and say a couple of things. First of all, somebody wrote and asked, is somebody trying to pull together an organization, what are the issues that people should be paying attention to? And I would say that's kind of the cool thing about where we are. I don't know what's important in your town. And by the way, neither does Chuck Schumer or, Kristi Noem. Ask people, what do they care about? What's important in your town? Like, what do you want government to do for you, and what do you not want government to do for you? That's a place to start pulling together new ways to look at the world. So I would suggest that you do that, but also to keep in mind what I was just saying about voting. It is clear that having failed to retain the popularity to keep them in office in 2026, and the recognition that if the Democrats take the House and even the Senate, the Republicans in the executive branch are in real trouble. The next phase is to discredit our elections, and then to try and make sure that they control those elections. And as that happens, the right answer is not to say they can't do this, because they are doing it. The right answer is to remember, what happened in Bush v. Gore in 2000, when, people like Roger Stone went down to Miami-Dade County in Florida and stopped the recount of the votes, because they ended up in the streets. And that is probably what we're going to have to do as they make this attempt to take over these voter rolls, is to show up and say, no, that's our identifying information. You can't do that. You can't have that. That being said, please remember that there are very, very, very good lawyers that are fighting every day, and they're winning. They're winning all these cases. So it's not like it's hopeless, but let's not sleep on that one. So once again, the thing to remember, I think, here is that we're where we thought we would be right now. That is, the popularity of the administration is plummeting, and crucially, the American people are finding their voice. They're finding their voice by showing up. They're finding their voice on social media. They're finding their voice with literally singing, with art, with helping each other out, with being who we are, and remembering that quite literally, the framers of the Constitution gave us that job. We have come to become accustomed to thinking that the government is out there and there are pieces of it and somehow it affects us. But the truth is, we are the central piece of the Constitution, and we have a job to make sure that there are checks and balances in our system. There's not corruption.
I'm sorry,
as a
job.
Our elected officials answer
Was
to
it
us.
40
And
years
one
old?
of the
That's
things
good for
Minnesota has
Beaver.
done is it's made it clear to people. It was there anyway if you were looking for it. But it's made it clear that the administration and elected officials do answer to us when we are loud enough. So anyway, I would urge you to keep your faith, and to hold in there and find your feet under you for whatever you're going to contribute to this movement. You bring your A game, meet some friends, and take it out there to do whatever you can do to change the course of American history, because this is our moment, and it's going to be bad. It's going to get worse. But as I say, I have so much more hope than I did even during the George W. Bush administration, because then no one was paying attention. And now finally people are. And as we pay attention, we're changing the course of history. Thank you for being here. I should be back on a more normal schedule next week. And I think Joanne and I are up on Saturday. Depends on, I actually don't know where I'll be on Saturday, but look for us, and I'll get back to a normal schedule. Thank you for being here.
I sell that other box?
Yes.
Real product?
Which box?
The other big one.
Yeah.
Really?
Unless you think that promo card is going to go up in price.
Folks, I'm trying to learn to do something new here, and I just failed miserably. But next time I'll get it better. So I'm back, and it looks like everybody is here. We have Grand Rapids, Michigan. Three Michigan people in a row for me. Northern Virginia, China, Maine. Hey there up there. Isn't today's weather great? I was so happy that cold weather broke. Ann Arbor. I love Ann Arbor. Omaha, Chester, South Carolina, Claremont, California. I'm not even going to try and pronounce that word in Canandaigua. Is that it in New York? I know how to spell it. I don't know how to say it. Reno, Nevada. I'm sorry. My friend from Nevada always gets mad when I mispronounce that. So, all right, the Eastern Shore of Maryland, Chattanooga. Oh, I had a great day.
Yeah, I think it's time to get rid of these.
A great Civil War battlefield on the.
They grow fast and eat a lot of food, but they don't like eating them.
Into the material that you asked me to cover today. A lot going on, but I think maybe I can put a little bit of a bow around it. If we start with President Trump's 18-minute speech of last night, which was not very useful if you were actually trying to learn anything actually going on in the United States right now, but I thought it was actually really an illuminating speech.
So sad.
Not because I say of the information in it, most of which was false, but the fact that it seemed in many ways to be a representation not only of Trump's presidency, but also of about 45 years of an era in American history. All right, so what am I talking about when I say that? So remember that Trump really came into his own
so we're going to get the flood soon. So this should be at 1.3, 1.2-ish.
In the 1980s, that was really his decade. And the 1980s were characterized
by
the
flood, the mangroves, which they need water, so they're kind of drying out right now.
That was based in the idea that the modern government that had regulated business and provided a basic social safety net and promoted infrastructure and protected civil rights.
We got these on auto controls now.
And underpinned rules-based international order was, in fact, not a good thing for the United States of America, that it was, in their words, socialism, because those social welfare programs that help the people in the United States, everybody in the United States, but especially those who had historically been shut out of economic prosperity and of the ability to get education and healthcare and so on, tended to be people of color and women. And so what those who were trying to get rid of the government that we had between 1933 and 1981 did is they said that those social welfare programs were a form of socialism because they required tax dollars to come from people who had money and income and be used in such a way that they benefited everybody.
So we need a little bit more of this. Oh, let's
redistribution of tax dollars, which they said was a form of socialism.
Yeah, well, we had the last population
crash by saying, it's basically, white tax dollars that are going to people of color, Black Americans, women who want equality and so on. And by the 2020s, 2012, for example, when Mitt Romney was running for president as a Republican, you remember people talking about the makers and the takers. You could see how this ideology really ran a lot of the ideology of that 40-year period, especially on the Republican side, although there were a number of times when the Democrats were sort of Republican light on that one. And that's the way you get these sort of eras in American history is an interesting one. But right now I'm going to focus primarily on Trump and where he was coming from. So the trick, though, is that with the idea that you were going to cut taxes and cut regulation, the idea was that those cuts would concentrate wealth among investors who would in turn plow it back into the economy in such a way that we'd have extraordinary economic growth that would help everybody. And with that economic growth, lower taxes would continue to produce more revenue than in the previous period when you had more regulation and higher taxation. And so we'd be able to have the kinds of social safety programs that we needed without actually having taxation. And if you remember, and I'm sure most of you don't because I'm on the older end now, but
This is our main industrial center.
H.W.
Not
Bush
one over here,
referring to
too.
this concept of the economy as voodoo economics. That's because a lot of people didn't think this was going to work. That if you cut taxes and you cut regulations, that in fact what you would do is take an express train back to that period before 1933, when you had exactly that form of economic policy in the country. And what it had done
My
is
favorite
it
part
had
is when
concentrated a
the water
ton of
comes
wealth
back.
upward. Really
We'll be
hurt
seeing that
the
soon.
people who
Let me go get a
needed
drink.
to be able to buy things, for example, to keep a consumer economy going. Ended up hurting workers very badly and ultimately resulted in the Great Crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed it. So a lot of people were really skeptical about this, but for a number of reasons that I mean, I can't give you all of 20th century history here in a half an hour, so I'll skip forward. But for a lot of reasons, that is the system that went into place. But here's the kicker, and to go back to Trump's speech of last night, it never worked. That idea that if you cut taxes and you cut regulation and the money that was freed up would get plowed back into the economy in such a way that workers' wages would go up and we'd get more tax dollars simply didn't work. What we have done since that period is to drive
So
our
close to
national
completing the
debt
tube
through the roof,
system.
primarily not through Reagan's tax
And
cuts,
then
but
we'll
through
probably have to get our
Trump
tube
tax
system
cuts
all the
in
way over here
2017.
because this is
And
probably
now
the
the ones
best
that will continue
underground
in place
ruin.
after January 1st of 2026. And
There's
by
an
the
underground
tax cuts
ruin
of
over
George
here, but it's
W.
underneath
Bush.
all
If
that
you
very
remember,
nice water. But I don't really want to
under Bill Clinton
get rid
in
of
the
all
early
that water.
1990s, Democratic President Bill Clinton, thanks to some of the measures that both he put in place and that
sorry.
George H.W. Bush put in
There it
place,
starts.
we actually had a
This one had
balanced
tidal
budget.
waves.
Okay, we actually had a balanced budget. And the first thing that George W. Bush did when he got into office was to blow that up with more tax cuts, quite deliberately, with the idea that so long as there was money coming in, that people, the Democrats,
See the
would want
tidal
to have a
wave?
social safety net.
Yeah,
And there was
last
a
time was
real
bigger.
desire on the part of a number of increasingly right-wing Republicans to
We
get
lose a little
rid
bit of water
of that
here.
government that first Franklin Delano Roosevelt had put into place in the 1930s.
That was the only way I could stop all the poop water from
and so on, right up through
not going on to our
Reagan
map.
had continued to support. So they worked to blow that up, to get rid of that money, and to say now you.
So the goal is to get the water over its head,
we don't have money to pay for them.
water in the
All
main
right, but the
roads.
trick here was that this never worked. The system never worked.
And then
I
we're
think
making
you
this
can
little basin
see,
here.
Some of that. Well, let me actually finish with what that argument
more
was.
water.
The argument
Always need
continued
more water.
on to say that those people who wanted a social safety net, for example, and wanted infrastructure, wanted education, wanted health care, and so on, those people were the takers, as I said, and they were overwhelmingly in this this vision, people of color, Black
See the
Americans, and women. And increasingly,
But yeah,
over that
getting rid of that
45
poop
year
water
period,
really saves
those
my ass
people
all the
got
time.
defined as being other,
And
as
now
being,
everything's clean water.
unwelcome in American society, as being the takers that I just talked about.
But
And
you can see
increasingly, we're
it costs me a
denigrating these people who
lot
should
of
not
material
have the
to block
ability
it
to
off.
govern. And you can see this in the increasing discussion of Democrats throughout this period as being un-American, as being as winning elections only by cheating, and so on. So you have this idea that the Democrats can only win through getting these people to vote for them, and that if the Democrats do get in power, they're going to turn into socialists. They're going to turn the American government into socialism. And that if you get rid of that system and put in place that Republican system, everybody's going to have this wonderful economic experience. Okay, if that's the worldview we're talking about here, a worldview that it certainly seems like Donald Trump absorbed in the 1980s and came to believe, the idea in it being that certain people, especially certain white men, were better than women and people of color and Black Americans, and they had a right to rule the country, maybe a duty to rule the country. Something you saw, by the way, in the Vanity Fair article by Chris Whipple that came out Tuesday, in which White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles actually says Trump has said to me 1,000,000 times, I judge people by their genes, Genes, by the way, not blue jeans. That idea that some people are just genetically better than others. So what you see, if you put all those things together, I think what you saw in that speech of last night first of all, was an incredibly angry man and an incredibly frightened man. And I probably won't have time to pursue the other obvious thing there, and that's a man who is mentally almost incapacitated. So you had all those things going on, but why? Why did that speech seem to me to be significant when it was really just an old man screaming at us, right? Think of what he emphasized. It was supposed to be a speech about the economy. And he did talk a little bit about the economy. And by the way, you can get transcripts of a number of those speeches. The big speeches, just Google transcript, Trump's speech transcript. The New York Times has one today, but many, many people do, which I find a much easier way to digest him, not least because I read a lot faster than you can watch something. He did talk about the economy, but everything he said about it was a lie. It was a fantasy. The economy is not great. The economy was, he said he inherited a disaster. He didn't inherit a disaster. He inherited an economy that The Economist, which is a center-right publication about the economy, called the envy of the world. The Biden economy was the envy of the world. Now, it did, of course, have the terrible inflation in the immediate months after the pandemic shut everything down because of supply chain issues.
I'm not even all the way
because
full
of
yet.
pent-up demand, because of pent-up, people had money. That certainly was part of it. But by the time Trump took office, that economy was booming. All he had to do was go on the golf course and drink Diet Cokes and let the Biden economy play itself out, and he would now be sitting pretty, and he could have claimed it all. And quite frankly, that's what people like me thought he would do, which worried me because I thought it would make people think that the economy that he was rhetorically embracing worked. Instead, no, he believed that tearing apart the kind of economy that Biden was trying to put into place, and I'll tell you more about that in a second, was the right thing to do, and that what he needed to do was to do what the Republicans had said they wanted to do since the 1980s, but never had done.
We've got
And I'll get to why they've never done it. And that is to get rid
I think we need
of
another
that modern government, the government that is our EPA, the government that is, the atmospheric organization, the agency that the Trump administration announced yesterday it's going to get rid of, the government that is Social Security, that is Medicaid, that is SNAP, that is all those programs that we have had for almost 100 years now, that support a social safety net and that have made the United States the strongest nation and the wealthiest nation on earth. Trump set out to tear all that apart. You remember he talked about tariffs and how tariffs were going to make us incredibly strong again. And everybody, every modern economist, and certainly every historian was like, dude, we got rid of that system after they tried to put it in place again during the Depression, and the tariffs of that era completely destroyed the world economy. That's not how the economy works. That's, it maybe worked in the 1890s to benefit the very wealthy industrialists, an era to which he looks back very fondly. But it screwed over the American people, and the system doesn't work anymore. Well, he didn't care. He's put that in place again.
We're so close.
And we're seeing inflation, we're seeing job loss, we're seeing all kinds of ways in which the economy is increasingly getting shaky. But that's not what he said. He said last night, the economy's never been better. I've created this booming economy. It is
that's not good.
simply not true. And
I've been letting it play
you
too long.
see the number of
My
places in which
bad.
he tried to shore that up, most notably
Because
in this argument that he is going to fund these additional checks of $1,776 for military personnel.
Really?
That he suggested was based in money that's coming from tariffs. Remember, money from tariffs comes from the American people. It is not paid by people overseas. This is money that comes from the American people, first of all. But second of all, that's not where that money is coming from. The news has been very, very clear about this, that today, that's actually money that Congress, in a bipartisan way, appropriated for housing allowances for military personnel, that he's simply going to rebrand and say, oh yeah, I'm going to put my name on it, and this is going to be a sign of how great my economy is. And that strikes me as being sort of this moment where somebody once described Trump, and I'm sorry to say, I don't remember who it was, and I wish I did, but as if your grandfather watching the Fox News channel suddenly became president because he believes all that rhetoric. Now, Republican leaders actually spouted that rhetoric, but they never put it in place fully. They made sure that there was enough of a social safety net in place that they could still get people to turn out and vote for them by dividing them along class lines and by racial lines and by gender lines. That is, you don't want to be one of those people, vote for us. But Trump didn't understand that. And what he and Russell Vought at the Office of Management and Budget and what other members of administration have done, including Elon Musk at the Department of Government Efficiency, what they did is they have stripped away that social safety net that we all rely on and that Trump voters too expected would stay into place. So now he's facing this extraordinary revolt on the part even of his own voters saying, what'd you just do to the economy, dude? And I will get to more about that in just a minute. But I want to finish with the speech first. So you saw that. But then you also saw, both in Trump and in something that the Republicans did yesterday in Congress, and that the Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. did today, you saw a real doubling down on the racism and not so much the sexism in that speech last night as attacks on trans people. Really very deliberately, Trump going after people who can't fight back, who are a small minority and already very vulnerable in our society, which again is part of this formula. Go after those people. So you asked me to talk about the bill to protect children's innocence that the House passed yesterday. And I think it's worth looking at that as a messaging bill from the radical people, the radical MAGAs in the House of Representatives.
Do we finally have our tube done? Look at that shit! Hell yeah, we got our tube done.
Transgender children under the age of 18.
Look at those beavers go.
Carve-outs. But what it really does is it targets people to try and get votes, to try and say, well, those people are different, those people are dangerous.
I can really smell the hibiscus right
I'm
now.
going to protect the children, which again is a really ironic title right now when we are seeing more and more from the files from the Epstein estate. We still have not seen anything from the FBI investigation of Epstein. All of that is legally supposed to come out tomorrow. Although that's the final date for it, and
okay,
I am
so this is
100%
reading or this
expecting
thing
fireworks.
is interesting.
100%.
You want to keep the water, so that needs to go all the way up.
So you can
These
see
need
that
to go
in
all
Trump's
the way up.
attacks on
I should have
Somali
actually probably brought these all the way up.
Minnesota, and also
before
on
that did.
his, he said, you know,
We should have
Democrats
flooded
are
the
trying to
mangroves
push
one more
for
time.
transgender for everyone. No, what Democrats and people who are protecting the transgender community are doing is they are trying to reinforce two
I don't know
things.
how that works at
One,
all.
the idea that we are all equal before the law. And when you start to carve out one group or another, it's only a question of time until people come for you. And the fact that the government is not supposed to intrude on our private decisions. And, you know, what you discuss with your doctor is nobody else's business. And this, I hope I have time to tell you about the 1920s, because, and in case I don't go for it, one of the things that I get time for it, one of the things that I've been looking at a lot lately, for other reasons, I'm working on a book, is the Buck v. Bell decision of 1927. And if you think that the government should be able to make your medical decisions or make other people's medical decisions, look at Buck v. Bell. Because that's the one in which the Supreme Court says it's okay for Virginia and other states to sterilize people that they consider undesirable, so long as they have a hearing about why that person is undesirable beforehand. And that the sterilization of Americans lasted, that's 1927, lasted, and I hope you're sitting down, until the 1970s. 1970s, it was still policy to sterilize certain indigenous women in American society. So that attack on transgender people, on Somalis, that's again part of that. Those people are other. You need to vote for me. You need to keep behind me. And the other piece of that was, I think, let's see, what else do I have here? Um, the oh, the other piece of that is his insistence yet again that he won the 2020 election, which is just simply false. He's got nothing at all except that he keeps screaming it. But that again speaks back to that idea that only Republicans can legitimately win an election. That despite the fact that President Joe Biden got more votes and so on and so forth, no, that was illegitimate. And that is part of that whole formula. So to have him screaming at us like that, those things that were false and that were so indicative of what was a wink and a nod and a dog whistle, when, except for people who were really watching, historians were real skeptical of Ronald Reagan, and so were a number of journalists, by the way. But he was genteel and he was quiet, and he sort of put a gloss on that rhetoric. It felt to me like what we saw last night was the degeneration of that rhetoric into an old man with seemingly mental health issues screaming at us that we had to believe this. We had to turn against our neighbors. We had to believe that the economy was good when it is demonstrably not. We had to believe that Democrats couldn't win an election legitimately, that only he could. And it just really hit me. That speech really hit me. Again, not because of anything in it that was legitimate, that was like a legitimate fact, but because it almost was like watching something crumble, which of course is what my career has been about, is watching this ideology rise and then fall. And so, when all you got's a hammer, everything's a nail, right? So maybe I'm just the only one who looked at it that way, but it just felt like a fitting epitaph to have this man screaming at us something that was demonstrably untrue, like believe it, you piggies, or whatever he would have screamed at somebody like me. So that, I think, is why that was significant. But now let's go another step beyond that, because one of the things that he is clearly trying to do is to rewrite the history of that last really 80-year period, and to take us back to the 1920s as if that was this great moment when we had quotas for making sure we only got immigrants from certain countries, when we had Buck v. Bell, when we had the Republicans in charge of a system that cut regulations and taxation that had been part of our society since the Progressive era in World War I, getting rid of all of those things. And you can see him trying to rewrite history in such a heavy-handed way that it is, I worry a lot less that it's going to stick than when people rewrite history subtly. And what I mean by that is, first of all, you can't have missed the degree to which he is literally trying to rewrite the landscape of Washington, D.C. He literally bulldozed the East Wing of the White House, which I still can't wrap my head around. And I have written about, if you haven't read about it, I've written about the fact that the administration is now arguing in court that it is a national security issue to have to continue to build what Trump wants in place of what he knocked down. Because in the process of knocking down the East Wing, they also made it impossible to use the security center that was housed underneath the East Wing, one of the reasons the East Wing was built. And they have to build it as quickly as possible to get that security system back, because without that, the Secret Service is arguing they can't adequately protect the president, which I have to say sounds a little bit like that old saw about somebody murdering their parents and then throwing themselves on the mercy of the court because they're an orphan, right? If he didn't want to destroy that, he shouldn't have knocked it down. But he's trying literally to impose what he wants on the White House without any of the usual reviews, without any of any input either from the historic organization that was charged by Congress to do that, or by the American people who by law also have a say in it, and so on. So you see it there, but you also see it in the apparent attempt to knock down 4 historic buildings, including the Cohen building, which has those magnificent Ben Shahn murals I've written about a couple times. Other people have written about it even more than I have, and much more in much more depth, and done a much better job of it than I did. But in an attempt to get rid of the Liberty Loan building and all these spaces there, as well as to put up a triumphal arch in between the Lincoln Memorial
Someone being
and
bad?
the Arlington Cemetery, which is it hits very hard, because the whole reason those are set up the way they are is because the Arlington National Cemetery is on what was the plantation of Robert E. Lee, and they were who was the one of the chief generals for the Confederacy in the Civil War. And so the Union buried their dead on his property quite deliberately to say, this is your fault. And then they built the Lincoln Memorial where they did, to honor him to sort of overshadow Lee's plantation. So the idea that Trump's going to throw an arch there it means a lot to people who care about the war. But in addition to really trying to literally landscape the Capitol, which I continue to maintain is in part because that's where he feels comfortable, is doing real estate stuff, and because his mind is slipping, that's where his handlers keep pushing him. Here, go work a little bit on your Rose Garden Club or your whatever. But he's of course also trying to rewrite history, literally to rewrite history, to get rid of the women and people of color and Black Americans who have shaped American history, and I would argue who are central to American history, because if you really think about what it means to be an American and what the centerpiece of American history is, it is the struggle of ordinary Americans to expand our democracy when faced with obstacles. And who does that better than anybody else? People of color, Black people, women, people who've been excluded from that concept of human self-determination. So by erasing all of those people, he's sort of erasing American history and centering it around people for whom that isn't a reality. They had those things. But he's trying to do it quite literally now in those stupid plaques he has put in the White House. And that is, I think, symbolic not only of his attempt to rewrite history. In those plaques, denigrate Democratic presidents and lionize Republican presidents, including himself. And he's got portraits of himself absolutely everywhere. What that really does, though, is it emphasizes the degree to which he doesn't really take seriously the institution of the American presidency. But he also is really, in many ways, as I say, bringing to life the 1920s again, because by getting rid of a system that we have had in place since the 1930s, that system of checks and balances and so on, what he's done is he's really opened up the way for extraordinary corruption, and he's opened up the way for there to be a sort of one-man rule. And by the corruption, I mean not only the fact that people in his circle are walking away with a lot of money, but also with things like the announcement yesterday, 2 announcements yesterday. One, that the government would be closing the National, and I'm not going to get the name right, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, NCAR, National Center for Academic Research, Atmospheric Research in Colorado. And it was pretty clear that they are doing that because Trump's mad at the governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, who has said he won't pardon Tina Peters, who was the election official in Colorado who breached the databases in order to try to make Trump president in 2020. Trump offered her a full pardon, but because he's a president, that doesn't do you much good for a state crime. In fact, does you no good. So he's trying to pressure Polis to go ahead and pardon her, or he's going to take away one of the crown jewels of our earth sciences uh, uh, apparatus in the United States, infrastructure in the United States. Similarly, yesterday, you saw dramatic cuts to the American Academy of Pediatrics. And there too, I mean, what good does it do to cut grants for pediatricians, the people who do pediatrics? Well, it's worth knowing that the American Academy of Pediatrics has stood up very strongly against the Trump administration's attacks on vaccinations, for example, and against its other attacks on healthcare in the United States. So this is a way to concentrate power among that very small group of people who are around Trump. So I think you're seeing here the destruction of American democracy is the goal. But what I think you're also seeing is the end of this era and its descent into one-person rule and the corruption of the extraordinary wealth of the United States and power of the United States going to a handful of Trump's advisors. And I think one of the things the interview with Susie Wiles showed us is that not one of them has an idea of the public good. Not one of them has an idea, even that what they are doing is good for the American people, except perhaps to the degree that somebody like J.D. Vance, the vice president, wants to impose theocratic rule on the rest of us because at some level he thinks that's good for us. But it just feels very much like every person in that White House is out to get whatever they can from this moment and from this president. And that is, I don't know, it just really felt like an epitaph to me last night. And I'm not saying we're done. I mean, I actually think the next several months are going to be a dumpster fire. I do know that, a lot of people have been writing to me and saying, why didn't you cover this in your letter? Why didn't you cover that in your letter? And there are two reasons for that. One is that my letters are already too long. I know they're too long. You know they're too long. They take way too long to write. I mean, literally, I'm doing nothing these days but getting up, writing until I go to bed. But also because it's just too much coming at us all the time. I mean, there's just, it's, I'm not crying uncle yet, but there is some point at which it just keeps coming over the transom and you're like, wait a minute, I've already got 15 things to write about tonight. I can't write about 5 more. And so I don't mean to suggest that it's over by any stretch of the imagination, but there's nothing new there. There's nothing exciting there. There's nothing but hatred and corruption and how much you can get out of things. And unless you're a member of that inner circle, you're not going to get anything. So it's a little hard to see that being an ideology, which is what I study, an ideology that is going to carry successfully forward. What you can see happening is it transforming into an ideology of pure fascism, the idea that a few people should run everything and that they're going to take over the businesses, as Trump, as you know, is doing, and use the military against the American people. That's an ideological direction they could go. But one of the things that I also think we are seeing is increasing momentum against that idea, against the idea of what you saw screaming at us last night from the White House. And that people have also asked me to talk about, and I will briefly here. One of the things that you see, I think you see emerging, is the recognition, finally, among a number of people who rhetorically thought they hated the idea of the liberal consensus, which is this government that regulates business and provides a basic social safety net and promotes infrastructure and protects civil rights and stabilizes the world. Rhetorically, they could say, I hate the deep state, or, I don't like what Rush Limbaugh called the feminazis or whatever. But they're starting to see that, in fact, they're the ones who are benefiting from that government, actually more than the people that they were attacking. And you're seeing there increasingly to be public support for a number of things that don't simply reflect the world that we had before 2021. And what I mean by that is that the New Deal government that FDR put in place and that Truman and Eisenhower and so on supported really emphasized the idea of protecting a male, usually white, but male anyway, breadwinner. The world, in their view, was centered around that guy who took care of his family. But that was actually never really the way society worked, ever. I mean, it's a vision of a heteronormative nuclear family that becomes very powerful in popular culture after World War II. But the world never really worked that way. And for some of you, if you think about it, you know that, certainly growing up in a rural area, grandma lived with you sometimes, or sometimes people couldn't go home at night, so they stayed at your house. And, there was a lot, there were a lot of, single sex couples, I have a great story, but of a name that one woman I can say it this way. I don't want to give you the actual name, but there was a woman I grew up with who always she lived with her friend for 1,000,000 years, because they were like 600,000 years old, right? When I was a little girl. But she always introduced herself as Miss by Choice, and then she would say her name, to the point that I was probably in my 30s before I realized her middle name was not by choice. She was Miss by Choice, and then her name. So we've always had these different family relationships. That's always been the case, at least in the United States. But so one of the things that I think you are seeing perhaps now is the emergence of a recognition of that. And what I mean by that is somebody has been talking about what's happened with the petition for the Affordable Care Act premium tax credits that the Republicans cut in their budget reconciliation bill of July, the Beautiful Bill Act. And what has happened to that? What happened was that the Democrats have fought very, very hard for continuing those subsidies. And the Republicans have been unwilling to do so, because that's a continuation of that government that I'm saying they're trying to get rid of. But there's such a recognition among the American people that we must have some kind of health care. And by the way, that was the Republican concept of health care that went into place, not the Democratic one. That was all that the Obama Democrats could get through Congress. So the reason that the Republicans can't come up with a different system is because that was their system. The other one is the idea of universal health care, which is, what other countries have. But there, right now about, between 75 and 80% of Americans want those credits extended. They affect about 24 million Americans. And their healthcare premiums are already skyrocketing. So, and a lot of people will have to stop insuring because of how expensive it's going to be. So you're starting to see, not only among Democrats and independents, both of whom have been pushing for this, but also among Republicans, a recognition that healthcare matters to people, and that healthcare is something that a modern government should provide. But there's other stuff that's coming out too. So obviously you're seeing support for education. But one of the words that I've been watching is the word child care. Now, if you remember, the Biden administration tried to put in place two kinds of infrastructure bills. And one of them was for child care, elder care, education, and that's sort of what I would call soft infrastructure. And that never made it anywhere. But I mean, it made it some places, but it obviously didn't pass. But you're increasingly seeing people talk about childcare. You're increasingly seeing people talk about creating a social safety net that does not center around a male breadwinner, but that centers rather around children. And that strikes me as being really, really interesting in terms of an ideological development and who's going to pick that up. So, one of the things you're seeing a lot is a lot of complaints about the Democratic Party. And there's this big thing out today about, the autopsy for 2024 and, who's, people are mad because the Democrats won't share it and so on and so forth. And I'm sort of the thought, like, I don't really care. I hate to say that, but it's kind of for me like doing an autopsy of the Whigs in 1856, in that by then the mood of the country had changed so that a lot of the ideas of the Whig Party moved into the Republican Party, but there were so many new ideas, it didn't really make sense to focus on something that was already in the rearview mirror. So in this moment, it just feels like we're seeing a lot of political transformation. You're seeing the standard bearer for the right wing melt down in front of us. You're seeing people trying to grab as much power as they possibly can under that standard bearer, but then you're also seeing extraordinary amounts of pushback, more and more amounts of pushback, where, for example, the New York City Bar today came out and listed all the ways in which they think that Donald Trump has broken the law. So, I got nothing really for you today except the recognition that, let me see if I covered everything. It's always kind of a game to see if I can get to everything you asked me about. The one thing I didn't talk about was the administration's threats to strip citizenship from naturalized Americans. That's part, I think, of that attack on the other, on immigrants as being something different than native-born Americans. It is possible to strip citizenship from people, but I think the average number of people from whom citizenship was stripped in the past was 9 people a year, and that is because they had histories of criminal activity or something major in their past that they did not share with immigration authorities. So this is new, and we'll see where it goes in the courts. But anyway, I hope that covers enough stuff. It just feels like we're in an incredibly unsettled time. But once again, I would urge you to make your voices heard now, to support those candidates that talk about stuff you care about. Is your person going to be the great hope of the liberal, small L liberal future? Who knows? But their ideas matter. And sometimes some of the weakest vessels are the ones who articulate ideas that stronger vessels pick up later on. So now is the time for people to make what they want heard, and to recognize that the momentum in this country right now is not on the side of Donald Trump and the MAGA Republicans, just the opposite. Their numbers are dropping. Susie Wiles's interview showed a group of people who were entirely out for themselves and looked rather like a dysfunctional family, and in which people like her were trying to make sure they were not the ones holding the bag if push came to shove and the law got involved. So you've got that on one side, and on the other side, you're having more and more voices coming out and saying, hey, wait a minute, we need to protect our immigrant neighbors. We need to protect our transgender friends. We need to make sure people are treated equally before the law. We need to protect our health care. We need to protect our education. We need to protect the climate. We need to enter the 21st century in such a way that we create a better life, not just a standard of living, although that's crucial, but a better life that enables more people to become the best that they can be and what they want to be going forward into the 21st century. I feel like I'm usually more cheerful than I am today, but I confess I'm tired. Lots been happening, and I just hope we all keep the faith and keep on moving and keep swinging even when you get exhausted, because we're in it. This is our moment to recreate America, and that, I guess, is to me one of the most exciting things, that when the framers or the founders who wrote the Declaration of Independence and then went on to frame the Constitution talked about their moment, they talked about how freaking lucky they were to get to write the history of a new country. And we're in the same position. So, take it with the joy you can, and let's just keep on moving forward. I'm trying to think of when I will see you next. It's at least on Saturday morning with Joanne, but we'll see what happens tomorrow. And if anything big comes up, which is entirely likely in the next few months going forward, I'll come back live. Thanks for being here. folks from Tucson, Minnesota, San Francisco, Maryland.
Increasing
There's
our
one.
production.
Dowagiac,
444.
Michigan. I've never even heard of that. Spokane, Washington. One I learned how to pronounce. Grand Junction, Colorado. Hartford, Connecticut. I had a great time in Hartford last year, by the way. Germany from Facebook. So I should stop looking at the different places you've been. Newton, come on, Chestnut Hill, where I is my other foothold, right? Anyway, sorry, as many people are, I've been spending the day running around, so I've totally forgot to send, I knew I was going to do this today, but I totally forgot to send out a list of questions or asking for your questions. You did put enough in the last 5 minutes that this is going to be longer than I expected it to be, but sorry about that. I do want to start with a couple of announcements. The first one is, yes, there are a number of deep fakes of me on YouTube. And YouTube in the past has been very good about taking those down. We're having quite a bit of trouble getting at least one of them taken down in the last couple of days. So if it looks funny to you, it is. I only have one official channel. This is the one that many of you are on right now. Anything else that purports to be by me is going to be a deep fake unless it is me being interviewed by somebody whose name you will recognize. So, there's stuff out with me and Paul Krugman, for example, Gilda Rand, lots of interviews that I do. Those will be on my channel as well. So if you want to hear from me, go to my channel. And if you see something else come up, especially one that's fed to you, what they're really trying to do is use my likeness to sell stuff. And that means that they've been putting out some real right-wing stuff and so on. There's actually a couple of them out there that are quite interesting. One in which I actually appear to have some sense of clothing, which amuses me to no end, because if you watch me, I just don't care about clothing at all. But there's also another one that I've got giant eyes, which kind of amuses me. I look like one of those little fur baby dolls, and I can't believe anybody thought I actually looked like that. But if you see those, please report them and put in the comments that it's not me, because at least one of them is spouting some really bonkers stuff. All right, so that's one of my announcements. The other is the Visibility Brigade has asked me to urge people to go to their website to look at Operation Fortify. That is the Visibility Brigade. They are the ones who do the signage over roadways, and they're a good group to be involved with, as is the Card Campaign, which has been doing great work now for a couple of years. I think
start trying to get this
by. And, we're coming into a really important session in American history in the next, 10 months before the next election. And all of these people are going to need to be fortified. They're going to need to be worked with and so on. So keep that in the back of your mind. Okay, so you had a bunch of questions today. But I'm going to start in a little bit of a different place than you expected me to start, I think. And that is with an article in the Washington Post today that said something we all knew anyway, but they actually chased down the facts and the stories for real. And that is the article in the Washington Post, as I say, establishes that the Department of Homeland Security, and especially within it ICE, has been quite deliberately using their arrests of people living in America. And again, there are some U.S. citizens in that. There are people who are legally here, as well as undocumented immigrants. But they have been deliberately using those as almost a film series. There is this attempt constantly on the part of the White House to every day
Alexa, turn Boathouse.
Boy, was that a split infinitive? Sorry about that. To release every day a video that draws eyeballs, and they draw eyeballs by using material illegally, like ripping off somebody's songs, by having something look like really dangerous, something to make you afraid, like just being so offensive that they can assume that people will share things, like, for example, the many ways in which the Department of Homeland Security has in the last week used the image of Santa Claus as an evil image, recognizing that people would respond to that by going, "Oh, isn't this awful?" and sharing it. And that idea of always staying in people's eyes has been central to Donald Trump's entire political career, and before that, his real estate career and his career on television. But it is very much a part of this second term where they're just constantly, as one person said to a reporter, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles has essentially been running a reality show out of the Oval Office. And so we have now this article that talks about the ways in which the administration keeps repeating the idea that they're arresting the worst of the worst, even though we know that that's not true, that significant numbers, well over half of the people, and it might be more than that, I actually don't have the numbers in front of me right now, who have been swept up in these raids have not ever been charged with a crime or convicted of a crime in the United States. And people put that, by the way, you put that caveat there, not because they have been elsewhere, but because reporters haven't been able to check records elsewhere that are often hard to access and kept in languages that the reporters don't speak. So when they use that warning and say, well, not in the United States, it doesn't mean that they're not telling you about other ones. It means that they didn't have access to that and they don't want to say something that isn't true, unlike what the White House is doing. So there is this sense of creating a television presidency. And that's increasingly showing up as a key moment in all of American history, where essentially we have a television president who is trying to project a certain kind of role of strength in this society and is trying constantly to have our eyeballs. And what he has done is he has taken 2 generations, really, of rhetoric from the American right that talks about strength being violence, strength being individualism, strength being ordering other people around and treating women and people of color and Black Americans as subordinates. And he is really taking that to an almost cartoonish level on the screen. And there is, of course, a goal behind this. The Republican Party embraced that ideology or that rhetoric in the 1980s, picking it up from the right before that in the 70s, the 60s, and the 50s. And they picked it up from Reconstruction before them. But the original idea of the Republican Party in its modern incarnation was that this idea of individual strength was a way to attack the federal government, the idea that you needed the federal government to do things like provide a basic social safety net or regulate business or promote infrastructure or protect civil rights or underpin a global international rules-based order. And they embrace that idea, that vision, that sort of cowboy individualism. Think of Reagan and that fabulous picture of Reagan in the cowboy hat. Reagan himself was a very, very good horseman, but he wrote in the English style until he decided to go for American politics, when then he began to ride in the American style. And you saw them doing this with the idea of cutting back the federal government in such a way that it would enable a very few Americans to concentrate wealth and to concentrate power. And that's exactly what we got. Now, in this moment, Trump is doing it, I think, for a different reason. He has embraced that idea, but one of the things that his constant television presidency has done is it's made it easier to get rid of the rules and regulations and the institutions that keep people like him from amassing a whole lot of money. There is some level at which this presidency is just one big, and you can see that from the amount of billions of dollars that he and members of his family have amassed just in the last less than a year since they've been in office. But what you are also starting to see, that was actually a prelude to what I was going to talk about. But what you're also starting to see is reality hitting this, reality coming in and smashing into this vision. And this is really interesting because this is actually what I study.
But then you
and maybe, I'm going to try
destroy
and
his reputation
on Christmas Day, at least record something early. Because I know Christmas is a really hard time for a lot of people, and it's nice to keep, the world turning in a normal way. And maybe this is what I will talk about, is the ways in which what we imagine structures the world in which we live until reality comes smashing into it. And that's, of course, a very deep theme in American literature, which is what my master's is in. And man, I could talk to you about Portrait of a Lady until I put you to sleep at Christmas. Maybe I'll do that. Anyway, this is really interesting because what people imagine really matters. Like a lot of historians will say to you, oh, that's just the Western image and no one cares about that. But I don't believe that. I think what we believe really, really matters. It shapes the way we see the world in any number of ways. But there does come a point when reality smashes in and you can't maintain your belief in that fantasy any longer. And honestly, when I think about it too hard, I think about the Garden of Eden and the concept of the Garden of Eden, which is a paradise, right? Until the people who live there begin to understand the world, they get knowledge. And then it's not a paradise anymore. They have lost that paradise. And if you think about the fantasies that somebody has, a child or somebody has about their life, like when that fantasy falls apart, things are pretty grim. And when you think about the Trump administration right now, that grim reality is really starting to smash home. So there was another story out today that somebody asked me to talk about, and that was also in the Washington Post. And that was, and by the way, normally I would have at the tip of my fingers all the journalists and all of that, and I don't tonight today because I actually took the day with a friend, which I don't know the last time that happened. So I just skimmed the news. I didn't read it the way I normally do. So I can't tell you who wrote the articles that I'm going to be talking about, although I did read them. The other one that I want to mention is a review of the Department of Government Efficiency, which was an agency that really probably did not look legal to people like me, that Trump established as soon as his second term began, and which he put billionaire Elon Musk in charge of. And that was all very, very murky. There's actually somebody on social media who keeps a running thing saying, who's in charge of Doge? Who's in charge of Doge? Because sometimes it was some person, sometimes it was someone else. And they would go to the courts and say it wasn't somebody else. And then Trump would say, oh, yes, it is Musk. And it's one of those areas in which the administration has quite deliberately tried to make sure people can't pin down who's making what decisions. And this is why you've got a number of judges running around saying, you need to tell me who is the person responsible for this. And that keeps changing in a number of cases that I'm not going to talk about today. But there was an article in the Washington Post about that Department of Government Efficiency. And if you remember when they came smashing in less than a year ago, but it feels like forever, their argument was that they had to slash the government because the government was too expensive, and this was how they were going to return the government to the American people. And this is how we got the destruction of the U.S. Agency for International Development, known as USAID or USAID. This is how we got the extraordinary cuts across the board to the Weather Service, to FEMA, to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, Administration, I'm sorry, the cuts we had to all sorts of things that got challenged in the courts and so on. But Musk kept doing these things and insisting, oh, I'm saving this many millions, I'm saving this many millions, and this is going to be great. Well, they really have run the numbers now, and of course, that's just a complete fantasy. And in fact, although there was utter chaos in the government in those months, in fact, the government spent more money in those months than it did before Musk started cutting. So there's another case where a lot of Americans had this image from 20 years, 40 years of Republican rhetoric that the government was bloated and that it was wasting money and it would be very, very easy to cut. And this was certainly the idea that a number of the Doge operatives had when they were embedded in these agencies. And what they discovered was, in fact, we have been slashing the U.S. government now since 1981, and it was lean to the bone. And more cuts did nothing at all except create absolute havoc and made it so a lot of people didn't get the services that they had earned or that they needed. And that's another place where a lot of people heard, oh, the government's bloated and I'm going to cut stuff from it and it's going to be great. And what they thought in their heads was they're going to cut things that I don't care about because there's so much bloat, there's going to be stuff I don't care about. And what it has turned out to be, of course, is that there isn't a single American who hasn't lost something that they care deeply about. Now, not everybody is admitting it. There are certainly areas of the country where those cuts are happening, but they're not clear yet where the cuts have come from, that voters are not clear yet where the cuts have come from. But that's simply going to get worse going into 2026. There is also this idea of Trump's tariffs, which he insisted were going to do these wonderful things for the United States. He wanted to get back to the time before 1913, which, if you pay any attention to sort of long-term right-wing discussions of the U.S. government, they always pick on 1913 as a crucial year. Well, the reason they pick 1913 is because that's the year that Woodrow Wilson, who was in the news recently because somebody jumped all over him as being a terrible president, and now I'm afraid I can't remember who. Ron DeSantis. There we go. Florida's Ron DeSantis talked about what a terrible president Woodrow Wilson is, and like any president, Woodrow Wilson's got a lot of skeletons in his closet, did a lot of harm in many ways, certainly to race relations. But the reason that the right picks on him as being somebody they don't like is because as soon as he was elected, he forced through Congress the Revenue Act of 1913. And the Revenue Act of 1913, and I can already see all your eyes glazing over, but it's actually quite an interesting law and an important law, because what it does is it cuts tariffs, because the tariffs, as you now know, raise prices for consumers. And around the turn of the last century, the tariffs were high enough that it was hitting everybody. Like tariffs on tin affected tin pails, and tin pails are what people carried their lunches in. And there's actually a tariff on twine and on the jute that makes twine, which again, you're probably thinking, I don't really need twine that much. Well, you did if you were a farmer and you need to bind up your wheat. So those tariffs were like the heart of why, if you remember in high school, you always had these classes about tariffs in the late 19th century. And if you were like me, you were like, who cares? The trick was that tariffs represented the idea that rich people were running the government, and they were putting in place these laws that were driving prices way up for consumers. All of a sudden, that feels pretty right? So I just came from the supermarket, and you can literally look and see the food that is being imported at sky-high prices. And then there will be like one article that's not that expensive, and you're like, oh, that's right, he just lowered that tariff, so that's in 1913. Woodrow Wilson lowered the tariff across the board in the 1913. Congress did it, but he pushed them to do it in the Revenue Act of 1913. And to make up the missing revenue, income taxes. That's the reason that the right wing is so furious about the Revenue Act of 1913, because it switched our revenue from relying primarily on tariffs to relying primarily on income taxes. Now, income taxes actually were invented in the United States in 1861. That's a kind of a different story. But Trump was explaining to everybody when he was running for office that he could put tariffs on. He kept saying they're going to be paid by other countries. Complete crap. They're paid by consumers. And that once we can do that, we can get rid of income taxes. That's where he was going with that. And now people are waking up to the fact that it's bloody expensive right now in the United States of America, and it's only going to get worse. At the same time, he insisted that this would bring manufacturing back. And it doesn't, it hasn't, at the same time that he has cut not all, but many of the green energy programs that the Biden administration established, which did provide manufacturing and especially jobs as electricians, union jobs as electricians and union jobs in manufacturing. So you're starting to see all this stuff kind of smash into the vision, the fantasy that he has been selling to us. So what does this mean? There are a number of things in that idea of Trump being strong and projecting this image of strength that we need to grapple with. And one of them you have seen in the news, again in the last couple of days, and that is the idea, once again, that Trump and J.D. Vance, and I'm going to come back to that, are talking about the United States needing to take Greenland. Greenland is an autonomous island that is part of Denmark. And Denmark is an ally. And similarly, there's a ton of pressure that they are putting on Canada. They keep saying that Canada has to become part of the United States. What on earth is going on with that? That was never, ever part of Trump's administration campaign in 24 or before that. And the answer to that is Trump is turning his back on the rules-based international order that the United States and other World War II allies established after World War II, which said that instead of having a world in which big countries can simply take over smaller countries the way that we had, the things that led to World Wars I and II, and certainly wars before that. Instead of that, the globe would come up with a series of institutions, and I always talk about the UN and NATO, but there are others as well that are, and CETO and now AUKUS, but there are others as well that establish financial rules, or so we have. There's actually a banking system that the entire world uses. There, if you're allowed to be in it. Right now, Russia is not, and this is one of the reasons Russia's economy is in such trouble and why they're so anxious to get back into being accepted as part of it. There are all these different systems, and what they do is they say you can't gang up. A big country can't just take over a smaller country, because then you got other countries that jump in, and then you're back in a war in having to deal with wars. Trump is turning his back on that. That's when he's attacking Europe, which is our, longest ally in this system. When he is focusing on insisting that somehow Europe is becoming less European because it's got immigrants and so on. And instead, he's turning to a system that is embraced by people like Vladimir Putin of Russia, which is the idea that big countries should take over smaller countries and have spheres of influence in which they kind of divide the world up by sphere. And it's pretty clear that the United States under Donald Trump, the administration, is trying to take over North America and South America, turn its back on Europe and other countries around the world and say, this is going to be our world. We're going to take the resources from South America and so on, and this is going to be our world. But that is also a world, a global system that enriches a very few people and takes us back to a world before we had free trade, before we had the things that have made this globe, not just the United States, but this globe advance so dramatically since 1945, in which more than 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's gone on here. So that strongman vision that he has basically is, I'm going to turn my back on having a seat at the table of the whole world in which we try and be equals. Try, mind you, we've never done it right, but that's part of the process, right? And instead, I'm going to go back to my little sandbox, and I'm going to rule my little sandbox. And everybody's got to do what I say, and I get all the money and all the goods, which is basically what Vladimir Putin has tried to do in Russia. And that idea of strength, the way that strength works under that system, people like me say it doesn't work that way. And you look at somebody like Vladimir Putin and say, are you really going to exchange the presidency of the United States and the United States with its extraordinary soft power as well as hard power around the world to be a tin pot dictator? And of course, that looks great to Trump because he doesn't care how big the pool is so long as he can be the biggest guy in it. So you see this in the many ways in which he is imitating Vladimir Putin with his name up on the Kennedy Center, with, he wants to build a triumphal arch. I talked about that the other day and why it upsets people like me so much. But then you also saw it in his recall in the last day or so of ambassadors, of some of our key ambassadors around the world, recalling them, saying America doesn't care about you anymore. We're recalling our ambassadors. And that is, again, an image, he's got this image that he's trying to portray that is leading us to this very small, very dangerous, very poor place. Now, it's not a done deal. And this is, I'm trying, it's kind of a game for me to see if I can work in your questions. A lot of you asked what's happening at the Heritage Foundation. And that's, again, really interesting. So the Heritage Foundation is begun in the late 70s, I think it is. It becomes really the mouthpiece for the Reagan administration and becomes the voice for the modern Republican Party, modern being the 1980s.
Oh, God.
And
What?
a lot of that is those people believe in
What
free
now?
trade. They believe that this is a better system than the isolationist system from before before World War II. They believe in a strong military around the world, which often, not always, but often imposes the will of the United States on other countries, which is where a number of people really split from the ideas of those people. I'm one of them. I don't think that's the way the American military should use its might, but that's one of the things they believed. And they believed in a small government because they didn't want business regulation primarily, and they didn't want taxes.
Now it's
But they
hungry.
also, some of the true believers
Are you
actually
hungry?
believe that a government should stay
She
on
just
your
told me she's
business,
hungry.
which is how you ended up with people like
Baby, can you feed her?
Mitt Romney's family supporting, and George W. Bush's family being some of those who began to support Planned Parenthood in its early days. Get the government out of our families. They don't belong. The government doesn't belong in our families. Those people, Heritage then got taken over about 2 years ago by Kevin Roberts, and he is a MAGA. He is a Trump guy. And if you think about what's happened to the Republican Party since Trump took it over, is it's basically tossed overboard everything I just said. It has tossed overboard the idea of the government of free trade, and now Trump is trying to use his tariffs to impose American will on, especially on North and South America, but on other parts of the world as well. It has thrown over the idea of American involvement around the world in favor of a kind of isolationism that really makes us completely pulls us away from the table in truly heartbreaking ways. I haven't written about it yet, but Mother Jones has just a couple of heart-wrenching examinations of what happened, especially in places like Kenya, with the end of U.S. aid, and people literally having to pick which child gets to eat. I mean, just really, truly horrific stuff. And then at the same time, the MAGAs have also walked away from the idea of keeping the government at bay from individuals, and they want to use a strong government to enforce their will on the American people. So one of the things that has happened is you're seeing a dramatic split now in the Republican Party between MAGA people, the people who are going to follow Trump, and they have begun to slide even farther right. So you can see people like Vice President J.D. Vance, who is the heir apparent to Trump, but that's not clear yet. I mean, obviously, if something happens to Trump in the next 3 years, he will step up. But he has very little charisma, and he is not popular. He doesn't have a base of his own right now. Anyway, he's reaching for it by working with Erica Kirk, who is the widow of Charlie Kirk, and they had their America Fest, Turning Point USA at its America Fest last weekend, and Erica Kirk said she will be supporting J.D. Vance for president in 2028, and he has embraced those young Republicans who were Nazi adjacent and admiring Adolf Hitler and so on. Remember, he said, oh, they're just kids. And he has really moved right with that sort of younger MAGA group that is moving right toward people like Nick Fuentes, who's the guy who supports the Groypers, or who invented the Groypers, who were far to the right of Charlie Kirk and who harassed Charlie Kirk all the time at his events. So that part of MAGA is really moving rightward. And what that's done is it's opened up some space on the right for figures who are still on the right. They're a lot of people are calling them moderates. They are not moderates. They are still far right. But they're saying we're not going down the neo-Nazi road. And that's going to be people like Mike Pence. Now, Mike Pence had his own personal issues with MAGA because, I don't know, they tried to hang him. But, or at least they called for his hanging. But he immediately after Trump left office, he began his own think tank. And that think tank is still an evangelical Christian think tank. They're still as Christian as anybody else is. but they call for free trade, for American intervention in the world, and for the government to stay out of uh, business, for example, which Trump has done. He's got the government actually taking pieces of American business, which is mind-boggling. I mean, that's the kind of thing that the Republican Party in the 1950s was like, this is communism and so on. And now Trump is saying, sure, why not? And MAGA seems to be going along with it. They don't want that. They're moving away from that. So Heritage, when it embraced Tucker Carlson after he did a glowing interview with Nick Fuentes, the far right guy, that was a big problem because the Heritage president, who's a Trumper, Kevin Roberts, supported that. And when that happened, the Heritage guys started leaving. And they had been there much longer than Roberts had. He's only been there about 2 years. Roberts is one of the key authors of Project 2025, by the way. And they have jumped ship now. Many of them have jumped ship to go to Mike Pence's organization. And that's, part of you sits there and says, who cares? Like, this is 30 people who are saying stuff you're never going to read. I'll probably read it. But there's a dramatic split in the Republican Party right now, and it matters, not only for 2026, but remember, Trump put enormous pressure on Indiana to redistrict the state to make sure that the Republicans would take all of the seats in the House of Representatives. And the Indiana Senate said no. A majority of the Republican senators in the Indiana Senate said no. And in the House in Indiana, they said yes, but the Indiana senators said take a hike. And that's not an accident. Pence is from Indiana. So there is this building sense that they are splitting. And, there's rumors this week that Ted Cruz is intending to run or thinking about running as an anti-Trumper. I'll believe that when I see it. But so there's this split. Now, one of the things about that split, and I'm going to come back now to the idea that there is this reality smashing in, is the first thing that you asked about that at this point you probably think I'm never going to get to, and that's the Epstein files. The Epstein files are weirdly big in American history, not just in this moment. Of course, they're big in this moment, but they got a huge amount of traction in part because QAnon formed in the 2000 teens, 20 teens, around the idea that there was an elite group, an international elite group of pedophiles that was raping children and often drinking their blood. That was part of it. And which is kind of interesting sort of in terms of historical patterns. Often when you get an elite in a society, there are stories about them eating or abusing children. I could actually make a list for you here in the United States, and maybe someday I'll write about it. But when you start to think they've got everything, they're taking everything, it's only a question of time till you start to think they're also abusing children. That's sort of the most heinous thing most people can think of. Well, QAnon formed around this, and Trump and his henchmen tapped into that. People like Steve Bannon and Mike Flynn tapped into that. And what became the story was that Jeffrey Epstein had been part of this. And Jeffrey Epstein, who was in fact, no longer present tense, raping children and just he's a convicted sex offender and so on. He became like this. They really fed this idea that there was this story out there about him that was going to bring down Democrats. And now, thanks to a single reporter, by the way, I believe at the Miami Herald, who would not let the story go, the Epstein story is breaking open. And as it is breaking open, it is clear now, for example, that Steve Bannon was a good friend of Jeffrey Epstein, but that also a lot of the people that the MAGA thought were going to protect the children that were vulnerable to this international sex ring were in fact participating in it. So what we are seeing now was Congress pretty much overwhelmingly said to Donald Trump, first through a discharge petition. Remember, Mike Johnson, this House Speaker, was trying to protect him from having the Congress say you got to release this stuff. But they, Republicans and Democrats together worked with a discharge petition to force a vote on whether or not the Department of Justice had to release the FBI's files in which they looked at the Epstein issue. Or the potential crimes created around Epstein. That's different than the Epstein estate. Okay, you got to keep those two things separate, because the Epstein estate stuff has been coming out for a while now. Now what we're seeing is the government, by law, by the 19th of December, was supposed to release all the Epstein files, and they are not doing it. They are breaking the law, quite obviously breaking the law. And this, they have, by the way, been quite obviously breaking the law in a number of different ways that people weren't paying attention to. The Empowerment Act, for example, the War Powers Act. But in this case, there is explicitly a law, and they are explicitly breaking it, which has opened up the conversation about impeachment. Because, you know, there are a lot of things that Trump does that are against the Constitution, for example, the Emoluments Clause. But it's not like there's a law that says, if you do this, you have to do this. Like for the Emoluments Clause. In this case, the law is pretty clear, and they are breaking it. So people are seeing in real time profoundly disturbing material coming out about the president. And this is only what they've let get out so far. There are hundreds of thousands of files out there, and they've released a little over 10,000 of them. And many of those are redacted. And you know they're being released selectively. So a number of the first tranche of documents seem to implicate Bill Clinton, former President Bill Clinton. He came out and said, I am demanding that you release everything that has my name on it, which really called their bluff. I mean, he's assuming, I guess, that he knows that he's not going to be in real trouble according to what comes out. That's itself a rabbit hole that I can't really go into now, which is an interesting one. But one of the things you should know about these Epstein files is everything that comes out you should take with more than a grain of salt. You should take it with the whole salt shaker, because if they have hundreds of thousands of files, what they've got is tips, rumors, ideas, hard fact as well. But they're gonna try and release the crap to muddy the waters. So there's something came out this morning or late last night that may or may not be true, I don't know. But anytime you see something crazy sensational, it's always worth taking a breath and waiting a little bit, because they're not going to be deliberately giving us the things that we want to see. They're going to be trying to set this up in such a way that they can then say, see, it was all crap all the time, which is precisely what you saw over the Steele dossier, if you remember that, and I'm not going to do the whole history of the Steele dossier. That was, again, raw intelligence. And the thing about raw intelligence is it's raw intelligence. Some of it is good, some of it is bad, and that when you look at it and you take the worst part of it and say, see, we told you it wasn't true, you discount all the stuff that was true. And so what you're going to see is a lot of this muddying the waters. The muddying the waters does not mean that everything in this file is bad. It means they are showing you the crap. And that, again, take a deep breath, no matter what comes out, and wait to see what gets corroborated. But there's an awful lot of stuff that has already been corroborated that's bad, really bad. So I'm really, when you get, many of you know to what I'm alluding, when you get something like that, to me, it's so bad that you're like, I don't know. Maybe not. We don't know. But we've seen a lot of that lately, where stuff gets out there and then it disappears. You don't know what happens to it. The story changes. Take a deep breath about that. But all that to say that the Epstein files are not going away. They are not going away. More and more people are interested. Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon is digging into the finances. He's had some great work on that. This is not going away. And what it's going to do is expose not only serious players in the American political system, but also in the business, academia, all the other fields that indicate that there was this group of people who felt that they couldn't, and this is the key point of view, that felt they could do anything without any repercussions. And while many of weirdly, two of my best friends, I shouldn't say weirdly because one of them might be listening, two of my best friends are scholars of ancient Greece and Rome, which seems a little random, I have to say, because we met in very different ways. But when we talk about this, they talk about the untouchability of certain leaders in those societies. I look at the elite slave owners in the American South who could do whatever they wanted, and they just were almost never called upon it. And that feels like what we're going to see from that. Another moment where people's fantasy about Trump is going to protect these children turns into, crap, he was protecting the people who were attacking the children. So there's that. There is also more and more coming out about these deportations or renditions. Remember, deportations are when somebody gets taken from one country back to the country they came from. Renditions are when they are taken to a third country. And many of the things that this Department of Homeland Security has done is it's taken people to a third country, then for deportation back to a country where the United States said they couldn't be sent because they were in danger of torture or death. The story that Barry Weiss of CBS spiked on Sunday was a look inside the Sikot prison, which is the terrorist prison in El Salvador, to which 242, I think it is, men have been sent, including Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and where they were tortured, and that story and what happened to those people. Again, the Trump administration keeps saying they're the worst of the worst, but in fact, they were never tried. They were never accused. Many of them were never accused of anything in the U.S., were never tried, were never sentenced, and certainly were not sentenced to go to a prison where they were going to be tortured. People are starting to be aware of that. And again, Barry Weiss killing that was just about the worst thing she could have done in terms of making sure people saw it, because she tried to spike it here in the U.S., but it had already been sent to Canada. Canada showed it. It's come back over the border. Thank you, Canada, by the way. So people are starting to see that. And there is also, I think, enough of a backlash to Trump that you're seeing quite dramatic stuff happening. And where I'm going with that now is that today, the United States Supreme Court sided against Trump on whether or not he could deploy federalized National Guard troops in Chicago. And they did that despite the fact that they have been siding with him overwhelmingly. The lower courts have been siding against him overwhelmingly, even his own appointees. The Supreme Court has been siding for him. So in this, a lot of people were surprised, and they said something really interesting that I want to dig into just a little bit. And that is, they said that he could not override the Posse Comitatus Act. And you've heard me talk about Posse Comitatus before, and I will write a whole letter on the Posse Comitatus because I know it really well for a little bit of a bizarre reason, but I will tell you some stuff about it. And that's that the Posse Comitatus Act covers the United States Army, but other branches of the military have adopted it since Congress passed it in 1878. The one group that has not adopted Posse Comitatus is the Department of Homeland Security. And in part, we don't want them to adopt it. In part, they should, but in part, we don't want them for the simple fact of the matter that is that the Coast Guard is in the Department of Homeland Security, and we need our coasties to be able to enforce the law. Because what the Posse Comitatus Act says is that the U.S. government cannot use the military against its own citizens. It's actually how we got the National Guard, because the idea was that the National Guard troops would be less likely, if they were state-based, to turn their guns on people in their states. How do we get that law? It's the story of how we got it and why we got it is really important because most people misunderstand this. What happens is that, and I'll give you the short version. What happens is that in 1876, there is a real fight about who got elected president. You know this, Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden. Looks like Samuel Tilden gets the most votes. He's the Democrat. He's a reformer from New York City. But there are 4 states. Everyone thinks there's 3 because one is in the far west. But there are 4 states where there's a fight over which set of electors should be counted in. And this is, by the way, corrected later on and why there should never be that happening again. As it came up in the election of 2020. But so there's a big fight over these electors, and nobody knows what the hell to do. And they have just finished with the Civil War in 1865. So this is only 12 years later. And here you've got what looks to be 2 groups of people trying to steal the election. Pretty clear that Tilden won the most votes, but at the same time, it's also clear that in the American South, Black Americans were prevented from voting. Black American men could vote, and the white Democrats simply kept them away from the polls by doing things like having shooting matches right beside the polls. They did all kinds of stuff. It was a terrible election. So was 74, by the way. I'll stop. Anyways, so in 76, there's this fight. And what happens is the election is in November, and this goes on like November, December, January, February. This is going on, and people think they're going back to war. And finally, what happens is there is a guy who is the head of a major railroad company in the United States. His name is Thomas Scott, and he goes to a number of Southern businessmen, and he says, "Listen, if you will support Hayes in the White House, putting Hayes into the White House, we will make sure that you get funding from the Southern railroads, which the South desperately needed because all their railroads have been torn up, and a lot of them had gone into bankruptcy after the war. It was a mess. We'll make sure you get Southern railroads, and we'll make sure you get a cabinet appointment." And people forget about that cabinet appointment. It's David Key becomes Postmaster General, and that's actually really important because he gets to put in his own people all over the American South in post offices, and they're going to be able to make sure that Democratic literature gets to all the Democratic voters in the South, which the Republicans hadn't been doing. People forget about him, and that's actually quite important. But so if you do that, and let us inaugurate Hayes, then I'll make sure you get all the stuff. And Tom Scott is like a really important dude. He's really rich. He runs the railroads and the whole thing. I wanted to write a biography once of Tom Scott, and somebody was like, "Yeah, 3 people will read it." But I actually thought he was really interesting. Anyway, that's the deal is cut in February. Hayes is inaugurated on March 4th, which was our inauguration day until FDR. And everything's hunky-dory, right? Except there's a big fight. And although the Southerners get David Key, they don't get the investment in the South that they were promised, essentially. So then a huge fight we're in 77 now, right? Huge fight in the summer of 77. And a major national strike breaks out on Tom Scott's railroad. And what happens? Rutherford B. Hayes sends in the troops, sends in the army. And there's a strike, and there's a lot of damage in a lot of places, some caused by one side, some caused by another. But what the American people saw was a government that had been taken over by a businessman. He had his guy in the White House, and White House then used the American military against the American people to defend Tom Scott's interests. And the Democrats sweep the Congress, and they're going to elect Rutherford B. Hayes in '84. But what Americans saw was the corruption of the American government by big business, and said, we're not going to do that. And so Congress passes the Posse Comitatus Act, which says the president cannot use the troops against the American people. because this is what they were afraid of. Now, if you can't look at that in terms of our government and say they were prescient, you miss the whole point of that story. So the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court said posse comitatus in this moment is a really big deal. And in that decision, there's the court split 6-3, but 5 justices all agreed, 3 justices dissented. Brett Kavanaugh wrote his own assent, his own concurrence in the majority decision, and in that there's a footnote, and in that footnote, he backs away from what have been called Kavanaugh stops. Remember he said, it's okay if they stop people just based on what they look like, because they'll just ask them a few questions and then the people can go. And we literally right now have a person who is in custody, who has a birth certificate and so on, and the government is saying, no, it's a fake. And people are outraged at the attacks on U.S. citizens and on people who are here illegally, to the point that even Brett Kavanaugh is trying to put, hey, wait a minute, Fourth Amendment here in this footnote. So the whole point of where I was going with any of this is that increasingly it seems like the fantasy world that Trump is trying to construct and convince us of, based on 40 years of U.S. Republican rhetoric, is under attack by reality. And even people like the Supreme Court are starting to recognize that this ain't gonna work. So at the end of the day, when I look at where we are today, I am watching, I hate to say this, but it feels like I am watching the end of a television show that just went on too long. The writers got lazy, people got bored, and now what we're gonna have to do is fix all the crap that we didn't do because we were watching television all the time. And I will write more about that in days to come. But tonight and the next night and the next night, barring some huge deal, I am not going to write about Donald Trump. I'm just not. It is time for us to take our brains back. And completely by chance, I tumbled onto a really interesting story the other day that is very important for today, and that's tonight's letter. And then we'll see where we go from there. But I will, as I say, try and do something for you on Thursday. But if you can think about things this way and stop, like I woke up this morning and I looked at at all the news in my feed, which I will continue to monitor, by the way. I'm not actually going to take a break. And I just thought, what happened to the days when in late December you watched The Grinch, or you read A Christmas Carol, or you hung out with friends without thinking about the latest lunatic thing that was coming out of Washington? And I thought, you know what? Maybe I'm contributing to that too. And I need to give people a little bit of space where I'll do these talks and you can keep up if you want. But otherwise, you know what? Read a novel, write to your sister, see if you can take a break just for a few days from the craziness. Because one of the things we're going to have to do in 2024 is we got to take this country back. And we will not take this country back if the MAGA Republicans are the ones who continue to dominate the way we think about this country. One of the things about breaking out of that false world is recognizing that we get to create the world that we want. And one of my absolute favorite poems is about the woman in the Garden of Eden, who is of course accused of ruining everything for the man and of eating the forbidden fruit. And the final line of it, and maybe again if I do expound on this on Thursday, the final line of it is that I wasn't expelled, I leaped. And when you think about what we can do going forward, if we seize this moment ourselves and stop reacting to the craziness that Trump is doing, we can leap too. All right, the usual, do everything that you do to keep yourself and this country on track. I will talk to you again soon. I haven't actually even looked at my calendar, so I don't know what's happening for the next several days. But for those of you who celebrate Christmas, I hope you have a great one. For those of you who don't, I also hope you have a number of great days. And for those of you for whom this is the hardest time of year, and I know so many of you who have lost people, and certainly all of us have been there, we see you. And you do whatever it takes to get through the next several days, and I will try to be helpful on that front as well. As usual, thank you all for being here, and I will talk to you again soon. Good morning, everybody. Joanna will be here, but she's still out on her run. Sorry, just kidding. I had to say that. She's traveling, so we weren't actually going to do a What the Heck Just Happened this morning. And then at about 1:38 Eastern Time this morning, the U.S. struck Venezuela, and I figured you all would want to hear about that. So let's wait for just a minute until Facebook gets here. And by the way, I was up when the strikes happened, and so I am a little short on sleep, so I may be not even this, more incoherent than usual today. Facebook is here. So hi, everybody. So as I said, I'm here today without Joanne, but this is a good time to remind you that she does have her own YouTube channel. She does do her own shows. And we always forget to say that because we have such a good time talking. And today she is on the road, so we're not going to do our usual What the Heck Just Happened. And I'm sorry about that. We had intended sort of to take the day off, but then, as I say, at about 1:38 Eastern Time, the United States struck Venezuela. And I wanted to give you the backstory for why this matters so much. Aside from the people in Venezuela, aside from the fact that Maduro is a really bad guy, aside from all that stuff, there is a much, much bigger game afoot. And I just thought I'd remind you of that before Donald Trump gets on the television and tries to explain to you why this was such a terrific idea. So let's start with the first piece that you're going to hear a lot of, and that's that Maduro's a bad guy, and he is. That just is the case. The government of Venezuela was elected originally, but then now he won't leave office, and he has destroyed Venezuela's economy. That's one of the reasons that so many Venezuelans are leaving the country and going not just to the United States, by the way, but elsewhere. That is not, however, really apparently why the Trump administration is going after Venezuela. As you know, we have been bombing small boats apparently from Venezuela. One of the things to be careful about in the news is that when people start to repeat stuff, it takes on a life of its own. So our understanding is that the small boats that the administration has been bombing by calling them narco terrorists are from Venezuela. But right now, we still don't know who those people are. So when I use words like allegedly or we think, it's worth remembering that it at least appears that one of those boats was not from Venezuela. And I say appears because the whole point is this has been shrouded in such extraordinary mystery. But the administration has been hitting those small boats, arguing that the drug traffickers that are using the country of Venezuela to move drugs are affiliated with the Maduro regime, which experts say is not the case. And it's also worth remembering that when the Trump administration insists that those drugs are killing a lot of Americans, they are implying that the drugs that are crossing Venezuela from other countries, by the way, Venezuela itself is not a big producer of drugs. It's a trafficking corridor. They're implying that those drugs are illegal fentanyl, illicit fentanyl. But they're not. The drugs that come across Venezuela overwhelmingly are cocaine, and that's what the administration has said to Congress that this is cocaine they're going after, but then to the public they're saying this is killing a lot of people. And cocaine is nothing to take for your health, but it's not fentanyl. So there's a lot of fuzziness going on around there. So what happened last night was an extension of that those attacks on those boats, which most legal experts think are illegal because we're not at war with Venezuela and there's been no due process for the people in those boats. And in the past, we have simply stopped those boats and taken them to a port for the legal system to work its course. And in fact, recently, at the end of 2025, when the U.S. hit a couple of those boats and it appeared there were survivors, they called in the Coast Guard to come get the survivors and do the normal, which is take them to a place where they can be tried or, arrested and tried. There appears to have been a covert operation in Venezuela that Trump blurted out on the radio the other day. But now, this morning, at, as I say, a little before 2 o'clock, the United States appears to have struck the capital of Venezuela, Caracas, and taken out, literally not killed, but taken away Maduro and his wife. It appears that his vice president, Maduro's vice president, has fled to Russia. But again, we're early days here, and I'm just telling you what's in the news this morning so that we have a baseline for the background that I want to give to you and why this matters aside from what matters to the Venezuelan people, whom I don't study, by the way. I only know any foreign country as it interfaces with the United States. So my apologies to anybody that I can't answer any more questions on that. But the story that matters here in the United States and therefore to the rest of the world is twofold. The first part of that story is, as I have been recording now for months, Donald Trump is in an extraordinarily weak position. That is, his poll numbers are abysmal. The economy is in bad shape. There have been signs that the economy is better lately than economists are saying, but we really can't trust the numbers anymore because he has because of the delays and so on. That's not to say that the economists working in the federal government are all corrupt by any stretch of the imagination, but those numbers are just not solid anymore. In addition to that, the Epstein files are clearly a huge problem for the former president, as they are trickling out. The Department of Justice has broken the law by not releasing them as the law required by December 19th. And the ones that are coming out are already really bad enough that any other president's career would have ended. And then New Year's Eve, the Republicans on the House Oversight Committee, led by Jim Jordan, a Republican of Ohio, released the transcript of the December 17th interview that former special counsel Jack Smith gave to the House Oversight Committee about Trump's retention of classified documents and attempts to overthrow the government on January 6, 2021, and everything that went around that. And that testimony was absolutely damning. The fact that they released it at night on New Year's Eve shows you how desperate they were to hide it. So with that backstory, the Supreme Court, before the end of last year, said to Trump that in a preliminary decision, it was not the final decision, but it tended to show which way the decision was going to go, that Trump could not deploy federalized National Guard troops in the area around Chicago. That's what the suit was about. But the implication was he was going to have to pull back his federalized National Guard troops from every place they are, except Washington, D.C., which is not a state and which is overseen in a different way than the states are. And Trump immediately, or shortly after that, said, well, I'm going to pull out the troops from Portland, Oregon, Chicago, and I'm going to go with Los Angeles again. I'm a little tired. but I could come back. And people at the time interpreted that as, I wasn't fired, I'm leaving kind of thing, that this was something that he was going to show his power some other way. And you need to have that backdrop behind you too for what is happening in Venezuela. Okay, so now he has struck Venezuela, and he is taking out the leader of
like
Venezuela
what?
and the leader's wife. Again, bad people. But he was on the Fox News channel this morning basically saying, now we have Venezuela's resources, primarily its oil and the sweet crude that is off the coast of Guyana. It doesn't really matter. The point is there are resources in Venezuela that Trump is now saying.
I'm not thinking
Again, he says a lot of stuff, but saying the United States now has control over, and that's one of the things that the administration has been saying, is that Venezuela took American oil and we want it back. And there's a long, complicated argument behind that, but suffice it to say that Venezuela did not take America's oil. That's a rabbit hole I'm not going to go down, because I wanted to get to this part, and this is actually why I'm here this morning. This is a really, really, really big deal that the United States has struck Venezuela. And the reason that it is such a big deal, aside from everything else I've just said, is because the United States, with this action, has signed on to the project of destroying the rules-based international order that the Allies after World War II worked with other countries to put together to prevent future wars. What that means is this. Remember, in the early 20th century, we had World War I, and then before that was even in the rearview mirror practically, we had World War II. And those wars are just hideous wars. I mean, they're world wars, right? And you know all the stories about both of them. At the end of World War II, the Allies, of which the United States was a major partner, recognized two things. They recognized that the world had to have a better way to solve differences between countries. And they recognized, especially Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower is going to become the United States president in 1953, was the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. And he recognized the importance of this. And that is, at the end of World War II, the world has nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are game changers, because what they do is they say if countries get mad enough at each other and you get a wackadoodle in charge, and he doesn't use the word wackadoodle, but it works. He's talking not only about political extremists, but also religious extremists and other extremists who can commandeer a population. This is a little bit of a rabbit hole I'm going to give you, but this is a real issue after World War II. People are trying to figure out why populations will follow a wackadoodle like Mussolini or Hitler or whatever. And this is this is where a lot of my work centers, is how do you get a population to say, oh yeah, I'm okay with this. And Eisenhower cares deeply about this. It was actually studying Eisenhower, that got me interested in it, because Eisenhower recognized that it was such a huge deal for the world going forward. He was profoundly moved by having seen the Order of Prison Camp and what humans would do to each other. And he recognized that if humans would do that to each other in a world that had nuclear weapons, they could literally end the world. So at the end of World War II, the Allies and their partners got together and said, we have to come up with a better way. And what they did is they came up with the idea that across the globe there would be rules, that rather than just having rules within a state, within a country, that there would be rules for the world. And those rules, some of them were financial, some of them were, we've got the International Declaration of Human Rights. There are all these different ways that the countries in the world were supposed to work together. And crucial to that was the United Nations. The United Nations eventually becomes headquartered in New York, and the United States is like the anchor of the United Nations. And the United Nations matter for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons the United Nations matter is because it says other countries, or countries, cannot invade each other. You cannot just say, I want your oil and go into that country, which is the way we got into the messes of World Wars I and II, that you must respect each other's sovereignty. And then there are all these ways that we can work out disputes and so on. Now, there are people, and I am one of them, who have always
It's
felt
going,
there was
what's
a
wrong with
weakness
it? Going,
into
where the
that
fuck is that
charter.
my sister eating?
But I'm not sure that's
I
a
don't
rabbit
know.
hole you want me to get
Is this one of
into.
them?
The
Yeah.
point here is
It
that
works.
there were rules, and
It's
big
solid.
countries were
But
not
that's all that's
supposed to
wrong with it?
invade little countries, bigger
How much
countries.
is
So
it
if you think,
for,
for
do you
example,
know?
about the first Gulf War, what the
600,
United States
700.
did under Republican
think I can
President
get for it?
George H.W. Bush
What do you
is they
mean?
said
If I
to
list it
Iraq,
online.
no, you can't
Yeah,
take
but then they're
Kuwait.
gonna give you a black
And
mark when
that,
it's
I don't know about
they
you,
can't
when
put
I
it
was
on
much
anybody.
younger then, and I was like, it's all about the oil. But in fact, there was the principle
There's
that
people
Iraq
that
could not
unlock
simply
it. They
say,
can
hey,
unlock
I'm
it.
taking Kuwait.
Mm.
We pushed, if you remember, the United States troops pushed Iraq back over the border and stopped.
That's
So,
it.
you do you.
I don't know, baby.
But we are.
Why? What does your
making
sister say?
sure that
She
you
works
can't
at
just
Verizon.
take over a smaller
She said
country.
this one was bigger to her.
You know.
All right, that's
I
the
don't know anything
rules-based
about it, but she
international
just showed me
order.
the statement for the other one, and she just
Now,
said, I don't know. I don't know
Russia
why it's
doesn't
not
like
letting you
that. Under
transfer it.
Putin, Russia does not want the
Very first one
international,
she gave you,
the
I thought of
rules-based
her statement.
international order because it wants Ukraine, and it
What do you
also
think?
wants other countries,
100
but
bucks?
pretty openly wants Ukraine.
I don't know,
And this
baby.
has been a struggle that's been
Well, let's
going
try to
on.
unlock
Remember
it then, or
that the United States,
break it or
Russia,
whatever.
and the UK
then
promised
resell
that
it?
we would respect
Then I could use it when
Ukraine's
this one breaks.
sovereignty if Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. It did give up its nuclear weapons, and in goes Russia.
I mean, you can
in
probably sell it for 600 bucks for
and the
Verizon
United
user.
States stood
They
against
said it was
that
still locked by
somewhat
Verizon.
half-heartedly. And this is the struggle that's been going on since then, since 2014, for the control of especially those eastern parts of Ukraine. Putin needs those.
If
He
you have
wants
that
those, and he
statement,
needs
then I can
those.
go
There's all
back
kinds of problems in
and
Russian
show
behavior,
that the other one was
which is
paid
actually
off,
quite
and we
an
could probably
interesting
get it
rabbit hole
taken
that I won't
off.
take you down right now. But he wants and needs those industrial areas of Ukraine in order to prop up his own rule in Russia, and that's in real trouble right now. Meanwhile, he also recognizes that Trump's position, including his mental position, is dramatically weakening. So if he's going to get that, he's got to get that now. So one of the things that Putin has articulated repeatedly is the desire to get rid of the rules-based international order, which he says is threatening him, even though it's simply saying, no, you can't take over Ukraine. And he wants to replace it with something based in the idea of spheres of influence. That is, you'll get one really big dog in an area, and all the other countries are going to have to do what it says. And that's his plan for going forward. And he obviously wants control of Ukraine, and he wants to continue to influence and gain control over Europe. And this is one of the things that Europe is madly trying to prevent. You're seeing the militarization of the borders with Russia and the repeated defense capabilities increasing in Europe. And they're saying we're very concerned about Russia deciding it's going to do more than it is already doing in Europe, where it's poisoning people and attacking undersea cables and hitting infrastructure and so on. There was an attack on Poland less than a month ago, I think, in which a train track was blown up. So Russia wants to get rid of that rules-based international order because it wants more influence in Ukraine, and it also wants influence in Russia. But there's more than that. Russia can't do that on its own. Russia is not strong. Russia's economy, as I say, is in really bad shape. And Putin's got a real problem. He's lost more than 1 million men in his war on Ukraine, which he expected would take a few days, right? How can he possibly do that? He can't. But the biggest dog in the world is the United States of America. So if he could get the United States of America to sign on to that, the game has changed. And this is one of the reasons that a number of people, including me, have called attention to the United States' national security strategy document that came out about a month ago, in which the United States no longer said Russia was a problem, but began to attack Europe, our ally in this international rules based order. With the U.S. attack on Venezuela against the tenets of the UN Charter, the United States is putting its stamp of at least condoning a big power attacking a smaller power. And you know that this is what's going on because instantly Taiwan, which is very concerned about an invasion from China, popped onto social media and said, hey, we're not buying this. You know, we're still believe in our sovereignty. And Europe instantly said, we still believe in the rules-based international order because they want to hold off Russia. So what the United States just did is it said, we're tossing overboard the rules that have kept the world from another world war since the 1940s, and instead believing that we want to have our own sphere of influence. And you can see this with Trump talking about taking Greenland, which, by the way, in April, just like a million years ago, Russia, Putin gave a speech saying, hey, take this seriously because the U.S. should have Greenland. Well, what's in Greenland is, of course, access to more resources, but also if the U.S. had more power over Canada, Greenland, the United States, and now South America, it becomes the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere here. It is a much weaker position for the United States than it has had since the 1940s, because rather than being part of the entire globe, we simply become the power that's going to grab all the resources in other countries. But it's one that looks very attractive to somebody like Donald Trump because of the degree to which he and his cronies can do what Putin has done, which is strip the lands for parts and put the money in their own
That's why I
pockets.
have some cards.
And
You want to go check?
already we are seeing
Nope, I'm good. You can go
people
check
in
later.
the circle reaching for the oil in Venezuela, and there's just going to be extraordinary
Okay.
corruption around this. Trump has done this without the approval of Congress. And that's the final piece here that you need to pay attention to. He has